What if the gods didn't leave because they wanted to, but because they had to? What if humanity's greatest achievement wasn't building ziggurats or mastering agriculture, but discovering something so profound, so dangerous, that it forced the divine to retreat into myth and memory? In the sun-baked ruins of ancient Sumer, where the Tigris and Euphrates once carved civilization from wilderness, clay tablets speak of beings called the Anunnaki, gods who walked among humans, taught them the secrets of the stars, and then vanished so completely that even their names became whispers wrapped in legend. But what if their departure wasn't part of some cosmic plan? What if it was an escape? What if humans discovered something that changed the balance of power forever? Something so transformative that the gods themselves had no choice but to fade into the shadows of prehistory. So before the story pulls you under, take a moment to like this video and hit subscribe, but only if you're drawn to histories that blur the line between divinity and discovery, between ancient power and human awakening. And if you're still here, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I want to imagine this ancient revelation stretching across the world, connecting us all in the dark. Tonight, we're travelling back to the moment when everything changed, when humanity might have stumbled upon knowledge that even the gods feared. We're going to sift through the archaeological evidence, the tablets that don't quite fit the narrative, the sudden technological leaps that have no precedent, and the strange abrupt silence that fell across the ancient world. This isn't just another story about ancient astronauts or mythological beings. This is about the possibility that humanity's ancestors discovered something real, something that shifted the entire relationship between mortals and those they worshipped as divine. And in that discovery, perhaps we'll find the reason why the Anunnaki, once so present in every aspect of Sumerian life, simply disappeared from history as if they had never existed at all. In the archaeological record, there's a problem that has haunted researchers for more than a century. Civilizations are supposed to develop slowly, gradually, across millennia of incremental progress. Yet when British archaeologist Leonard Woolley first excavated the ancient city of Ur in the 1920s, he found something that defied this comfortable narrative. Beneath the desert sand lay not the crude beginnings of a developing culture, but a fully formed civilization that appeared to spring into existence with writing, mathematics, astronomy, law codes, and complex architecture already perfected. It was as if someone had simply turned on a switch and civilization blazed into being, complete and sophisticated from its very first moment. Imagine standing at the edge of Woolley's excavation pit, watching as workers carefully brush away millennia of accumulated sand. Layer by layer they're moving backward through time, past Islamic period pottery, past Babylonian bricks, past Akkadian artifacts, deeper and deeper until they reach the earliest levels of Sumerian occupation. And what they find there isn't what it should be. There's no gradual improvement from crude huts to sophisticated structures. The earliest buildings already show urban planning, standardized measurements, and architectural knowledge that should have taken generations to develop. The pottery isn't experimental or primitive. It's already wheel-thrown, symmetrical, decorated with geometric precision. The irrigation canals that fed the city weren't simple ditches that gradually improved. They were engineered waterworks that understood hydraulics, mathematics, and long-term agricultural planning from their very first construction. Woolley wasn't alone in noticing this pattern. German archaeologist Robert Koldewey, excavating Babylon in the early 20th century, encountered the same mystery. French teams at Lagash, American expeditions at Nippur, British archaeologists at Eridu, all of them uncovered the same troubling pattern. Sumerian civilization didn't emerge slowly from the Neolithic period. It exploded into existence around 3300 BCE with capabilities that had no visible developmental history. Writing appeared not as crude pictograms gradually evolving over centuries, but as an already sophisticated system capable of recording complex legal codes, mathematical calculations, and detailed astronomical observations. The cuneiform script that would dominate Mesopotamian civilization for 3,000 years was essentially complete in its earliest attestations, as if the Sumerians hadn't invented writing but had learned it from someone who already understood how written language should work. The mathematics were even more troubling. The Sumerian base 60 system wasn't a simple counting method that gradually became more complex. It was a sophisticated mathematical framework from the very beginning, capable of expressing fractions, calculating areas and volumes, solving algebraic problems, and recording astronomical data with precision that wouldn't be matched for thousands of years. Modern mathematicians examining the oldest Sumerian mathematical tablets don't see a civilization learning to count. They see a civilization that already possessed advanced mathematical knowledge, recording calculations that required conceptual sophistication far beyond what simple bookkeeping would demand. And then there's the question that keeps archaeologists awake at night. The question that hovers over every Sumerian excavation like a ghost that won't be laid to rest. Where did it come from? Every other civilization shows its roots, its developmental history, its gradual accumulation of knowledge. The Egyptians built progressively more sophisticated structures over centuries before achieving the pyramids. The Chinese developed writing through clear evolutionary stages. The Indus Valley civilization shows archaeological evidence of gradual urbanization. But Sumer? Sumer simply appears in the historical record already mature, already sophisticated, as if civilization itself had been transplanted fully formed into the Mesopotamian plain. The Sumerians themselves offered an answer to this question, though it's an answer that makes modern scholars deeply uncomfortable. According to their own records, they didn't slowly develop civilization through trial and error. They were taught. The knowledge came from somewhere, from someone, from beings they called the Anunnaki. And those beings, according to the tablets, didn't observe humanity from a distance but walked among them, spoke with them, instructed them in the arts of civilization with the patience of teachers who already possessed the knowledge they were imparting. But it was the tablets, always the tablets, that carried the real weight of these claims. The clay tablets of ancient Sumer speak of them with a mixture of reverence and familiarity that feels almost uncomfortable to modern readers. The Anunnaki weren't distant, unknowable gods dwelling in some unreachable heaven. They walked the streets of Sumerian cities, sat in judgment over disputes, taught humans the arts of civilization, and according to the texts, performed physical labor alongside mortals before deciding to create humanity as workers. The cuneiform inscriptions describe them in terms that blur the line between deity and being, gods who ate and drank, who married and had children, who made decisions in councils and assemblies just as human rulers did. Samuel Noah Kramer, the legendary Sumerologist who spent decades translating these ancient texts, noted something peculiar in his translations. The Anunnaki weren't worshipped with the distant awe reserved for truly divine beings, but with something closer to practical respect, as if they were powerful authorities rather than incomprehensible gods. The tablets describe the Anunnaki in remarkably concrete terms. They had names, individual personalities, specific domains of responsibility. An, the sky god, ruled from above. Enlil controlled the winds and storms. Enki, whose name means Lord of the Earth, governed wisdom, water, and the teaching of crafts. Ninhursag presided over fertility and the mountains. Inanna commanded love and war with equal intensity. These weren't abstract theological concepts. They were beings with biographies, with family relationships that the texts record in exhaustive detail, with political alliances and conflicts that played out in ways that sound more like historical chronicle than religious mythology. What's particularly striking is the physicality of these descriptions. The Anunnaki didn't manifest as visions or dreams. They resided in temples that were called their actual houses, structures where they were fed offerings that the texts describe them consuming. They travelled between cities, and the journeys took time, following routes that can still be traced on maps of ancient Mesopotamia. When they spoke, their words were recorded by scribes with the same matter-of-fact accuracy used for royal decrees. When they made decisions, those decisions were implemented by human administrators who understood themselves to be following direct divine instruction, not interpreting abstract theological principles. The Atrahasis epic, one of the most important texts preserving early Mesopotamian tradition, describes the Anunnaki in terms that sound almost bureaucratic. It explains that the Anunnaki were divided into ranks, with the senior gods making decisions while junior Anunnaki performed the actual labour of digging irrigation canals, building cities, and maintaining the infrastructure of civilization. The text records that these lesser Anunnaki eventually rebelled against the endless toil, gathering with their tools of labour and marching to the dwelling of Enlil to demand relief from their burdens. The solution to this labour dispute was the creation of humanity, beings who would take over the work and free the Anunnaki from physical toil. This isn't the language of pure mythology. It's the language of beings who worked, who got tired, who organized politically, who sought solutions to practical problems. The text doesn't present this as allegory or metaphor. It describes it as history, as the actual reason humanity exists. And throughout these descriptions there's an implied physicality, a sense that the Anunnaki occupied the same material reality as humans, that they were subject to similar needs and limitations, even if they possessed knowledge and capabilities far beyond mortal reach. Kramer, who translated more Sumerian texts than perhaps any other scholar, struggled throughout his career with how to interpret these descriptions. As a rigorous academic, he couldn't accept them as literal history, yet as a translator intimately familiar with the actual Sumerian language, he couldn't ignore how consistently the text treated the Anunnaki as real, present beings rather than abstract theological constructs. In his writings, there's a tension between scholarly caution and honest puzzlement, a sense that the texts were saying something that didn't fit comfortably into any existing framework, for understanding ancient religion. And then there was the knowledge itself, the practical instruction that the tablets claimed the Anunnaki provided, knowledge that seemed to encompass every aspect of civilization, from agriculture to astronomy. When modern astronomers first examined the astronomical tablets recovered from the library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, they encountered something that shouldn't have been possible with the naked eye and primitive instruments. The Sumerians and their Babylonian successors had mapped the night sky with a precision that wouldn't be matched again until the invention of the telescope. They knew the planets, tracked their movements with mathematical accuracy, understood the precession of the equinoxes, and recorded celestial events with timing so exact that modern computers can verify their observations thousands of years later. But here's what disturbs astronomers who study these ancient records. The level of detail, the mathematical sophistication, and the sheer scope of their skywatching suggests not just careful observation over generations, but instruction from teachers who already understood celestial mechanics. The tablets record planetary movements using mathematical models that calculate positions centuries into the future and past. They identify subtle variations in celestial cycles that should require sophisticated instruments to detect. They understand that the Earth's axis precesses through a cycle lasting approximately 26,000 years, a phenomenon so gradual that detecting it requires comparing observations across many human lifetimes. Yet the Mesopotamian astronomers not only knew about precession, they calculated its rate with impressive accuracy, and used this knowledge to adjust their astronomical calendars and predict celestial events with timing that still astonishes modern researchers. Consider what this level of astronomical knowledge requires. You need generations of meticulous observers recording the positions of stars and planets with consistent accuracy. You need mathematical frameworks capable of analyzing cyclical patterns spanning decades or centuries. You need institutional continuity that preserves observations across multiple human lifetimes and makes them available to later scholars who can identify patterns invisible to a single generation. You need, in essence, a sophisticated scientific tradition with methods, training, and institutional support. Yet in the earliest Mesopotamian texts, this astronomical knowledge appears already mature, already sophisticated, without visible developmental history. The Mul-Apian tablets, named for the constellation they begin with, are perhaps the most comprehensive astronomical texts to survive from ancient Mesopotamia. Dating to around 700 BCE, but preserving much older Babylonian and Sumerian traditions, they contain star catalogues, listing dozens of constellations with their rising and setting times throughout the year. They describe the paths of the planets through the zodiac with mathematical precision. They record the lengths of daylight throughout the seasons. They provide instructions for using stellar risings to determine the calendar and predict agricultural seasons. The knowledge encoded in these tablets represents an astronomical tradition of stunning sophistication. Yet that tradition claims to trace back to the earliest periods of Sumerian civilization, to the time when, according to the texts themselves, the Anunnaki were teaching humans to watch the skies with purpose and precision. Modern astronomers analyzing these ancient observations have verified their accuracy by running computer simulations of ancient skies. The Mesopotamian records of eclipses, planetary conjunctions, and stellar positions match what actually occurred with remarkable fidelity. These weren't approximate observations or lucky guesses. They were precise measurements recorded by skilled observers who understood what they were seeing and possessed the mathematical tools to calculate celestial movements with scientific accuracy. Dr. John Britton, a historian of ancient astronomy at the University of Toronto, has noted that Babylonian astronomical methods were in some ways more sophisticated than those developed by early modern European astronomers, with computational techniques that wouldn't be improved upon until the invention of calculus. But perhaps the most intriguing aspect of Mesopotamian astronomy is its focus. These weren't casual sky watchers noticing bright stars and making up stories about them. They were systematic observers tracking specific celestial phenomena with focused intensity, as if they were looking for something, as if the movements of the heavens carried information they desperately needed to know. The tablets record observations with an urgency that goes beyond scientific curiosity. They watched the skies the way sentries watch for approaching enemies, the way sailors watch for signs of coming storms. They watched as if the heavens might at any moment provide a signal, a warning, a message they had been taught to anticipate. And according to their own records, they had learned this focused attention from the Anunnaki, who had taught them not just how to observe the stars, but why such observation was necessary, what patterns to watch for, what celestial movements carried meaning. The sky wasn't just beautiful to the ancient Mesopotamians. It was a text to be read, a message board where crucial information was constantly being posted for those who knew how to decode it. And that knowledge, that ability to read meaning in stellar movements, was, according to the tablets themselves, a gift from beings who already understood the celestial mechanics that humans were only beginning to grasp. Yet the relationship that these tablets describe, this close interaction between divine teachers and human students, this constant presence of the Anunnaki in Sumerian affairs, didn't continue forever. Something happened around 3,500 years ago that changed everything about how Mesopotamian cultures recorded their interactions with the divine. In the earliest Sumerian texts, the Anunnaki are everywhere, active participants in human affairs, making decisions, teaching skills, walking among the cities. But then, gradually at first and then with surprising completeness, direct references to the Anunnaki simply stop. Later, Babylonian and Assyrian texts still acknowledge them, but now they're distant, mythological, part of the creation stories rather than active presences in the contemporary world. It's as if a door closed somewhere in the deep past, and the beings who had once been so present simply withdrew behind it, leaving only memories and increasingly abstract mythology in their wake. Scholars have puzzled over this transition for decades, usually explaining it as a natural evolution of religious thought, but the abruptness of the change has always felt like something else, like a deliberate retreat rather than a gradual cultural shift. You can trace this transition through the tablets themselves, watching as the language changes, as the relationship transforms. In texts from the early dynastic period, around 2800 to 2300 BCE, the Anunnaki are described making specific decisions about specific situations. Kings claim to have received direct instruction from named Anunnaki. Priests record conversations and commands. The gods aren't theological abstractions, but active agents in current events, making choices that directly impact human affairs. The tone of these texts is immediate, concrete, contemporary. These aren't myths about the distant past. They're records of ongoing relationships. But by the time we reach the first millennium BCE, something fundamental has shifted. The Anunnaki are still mentioned, still revered, but now they're part of ancient history rather than current reality. Texts from this period speak of the Anunnaki as creators, as the beings who established civilization in the beginning of time, but they no longer describe the Anunnaki as present, active participants in contemporary events. Kings still claim divine mandate, but now that mandate comes through omens and signs rather than direct conversation. Priests still serve the gods, but now they interpret rather than transmit direct divine communication. What happened? The standard scholarly explanation is that Mesopotamian religion evolved from more anthropomorphic early beliefs toward more abstract theological concepts, that the active physical gods of early Sumer gradually transformed into the distant, transcendent deities of later Babylonian theology. This is the natural progression of religious thought, scholars argue, observable in many cultures as theology becomes more sophisticated and philosophical. Yet this explanation doesn't quite account for the abruptness of the transition. The way the Anunnaki don't gradually become more distant, but rather suddenly step back, as if withdrawing deliberately rather than fading naturally through cultural evolution. Some tablets hint at explanations, fragmentary texts that suggest something changed in the relationship between humans and the divine, references to knowledge that was shared but shouldn't have been, mentions of boundaries that were crossed, of humans achieving capabilities that made the old relationship untenable. These hints are frustratingly incomplete, broken tablets with missing sections, texts that seem to approach a crucial revelation only to end abruptly or dissolve into mythological language that obscures more than it reveals. But collectively, they suggest that the Anunnaki's withdrawal wasn't arbitrary, wasn't simply the natural evolution of religious thought, but a response to something that happened, some change in human capability or knowledge that made continued close interaction impossible or unnecessary or dangerous. And it's at the oldest sites, the places where Sumerian civilization first took root, that the archaeological evidence of this transition becomes most intriguing. At Eridu, the oldest city in Mesopotamia and perhaps the world, archaeologists discovered something that fundamentally challenges our understanding of religious development. Beneath 17 successive temple structures, each built directly atop the ruins of the previous one, they found the original sanctuary, a simple but precisely constructed building dating to approximately 5,300 years ago. But what troubles researchers is this. Even the earliest temple shows sophisticated architectural knowledge, astronomical alignment, and complex ritual purpose. There's no primitive stage, no experimental phase, no gradual development from simple shrine to elaborate temple. The very first structure demonstrates knowledge that should have taken centuries to accumulate, and according to Sumerian tradition, Eridu was where the Anunnaki first established contact with humanity, where knowledge was first transferred from the divine to the mortal realm. Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd, the archaeologists who excavated Eridu in the 1940s and 50s, documented the temple sequence with meticulous care, photographing and measuring each successive level as they dug deeper into the accumulated millennia. What they found was remarkable not for its variety but for its consistency. Each temple was larger and more elaborate than the one below it, but they all shared the same basic design, the same orientation, the same spatial relationships between altar, offering table, and central chamber. It was as if the original architects had established a template that remained sacred for thousands of years, each generation of builders faithfully reproducing the essential pattern, even as they expanded and elaborated the structure. But that original template, that first temple at the bottom of the stratigraphic sequence, already contained that pattern fully formed. The earlier structure wasn't a crude prototype that later builders gradually improved. It was a sophisticated design that established principles its builders' descendants would follow for millennia. The walls were precisely aligned to cardinal directions. The altar placement showed understanding of sight lines and ritual movement. The entire structure demonstrated knowledge of sacred architecture that should, according to our understanding of how knowledge develops, have required generations of experimentation to achieve. The surrounding settlement showed the same troubling pattern. The earliest levels of occupation at Eridu weren't primitive camps gradually evolving toward urban complexity. They were planned communities with organized street layouts, standardized house designs, and evidence of specialized labor from the very beginning. The pottery was already wheel-thrown and technically sophisticated. The agricultural practices already showed understanding of irrigation, crop rotation, and surplus management. Everything that should have taken centuries to develop was simply present from the start, as if Eridu hadn't grown organically, but had been founded by people who already knew how cities should work, how temples should be constructed, how civilization should be organized. And according to Sumerian tradition, this wasn't accidental. Eridu was special, sacred, the place where civilization began not through human innovation, but through divine instruction. The texts record that Eridu was the city of Enki, the Anunnaki, who most consistently appears in contexts involving the transfer of knowledge from divine to human realms. His temple at Eridu wasn't just a place of worship, but a center of learning, where priests were trained, where astronomical observations were recorded, where the arts of civilization were taught to humans by beings who already possessed the wisdom they were sharing. The temple wasn't a monument to the gods. It was, according to the tablets, a school where divine teachers instructed mortal students in knowledge that would spread from Eridu to transform human existence across all of Mesopotamia. The water that surrounded Eridu's temples was considered sacred. The Abzu, the subterranean freshwater realm that Enki governed. In Sumerian cosmology, the Abzu wasn't just a mythological concept, but a physical reality. The underground aquifer that fed the Mesopotamian rivers and made agriculture possible in an otherwise arid landscape. And Enki's association with this water carried double meaning. He was lord of the physical waters that sustained life, but also, according to the texts, guardian of the deep wisdom, the fundamental knowledge that underlay all civilization. The tablets describe the me, untranslatable Sumerian concepts that seem to represent fundamental principles, essential knowledge, the building blocks of civilized existence. And these me resided in the Abzu in Enki's domain, available to humanity only because Enki chose to share them, chose to bring hidden wisdom up from the depths and teach it to mortals who would otherwise have remained ignorant. But if Eridu was where the knowledge was first given, where divine teachers first instructed human students, where the Anunnaki established their initial contact with humanity, then perhaps Eridu was also where something changed, where the relationship that had begun with such promise eventually reached the point where the teachers had to step back, where humans learned something that made continued divine presence no longer necessary, or no longer safe, or no longer possible. The 17 temples, built one atop another, spanned thousands of years of Mesopotamian history. Somewhere in that sequence, somewhere in those accumulated centuries, the active presence of the Anunnaki faded from immediacy into memory, from physical teachers into mythological founders. And the question that haunts anyone who stands among Eridu's ruins is simple but profound. What happened in that transition? What did humans discover, achieve, or understand that changed everything about their relationship with beings they had once called gods? Among the Anunnaki, one figure appears again and again in contexts involving knowledge, wisdom, and the teaching of secrets to humanity. Enki, whose name means Lord of the Earth, was, according to the tablets, the Anunnaki most sympathetic to human development, the one who argued for humanity's education rather than their subjugation. His temple at Eridu contained what the texts describe as the Quote One, a Sumerian concept that has no direct translation, but seems to encompass fundamental knowledge, divine powers, and the essential principles governing civilization and existence itself. The tablets record that Enki possessed these Mi, and, contrary to the wishes of other Anunnaki, shared aspects of them with humanity. But they also record that this sharing was controversial, dangerous, and ultimately led to consequences that reverberate through the mythology, like aftershocks from an ancient catastrophe. The concept of the Me is one of the most fascinating and frustrating elements in Sumerian literature. Modern scholars have struggled for decades to understand exactly what the tablets mean when they refer to these mysterious entities. The word appears hundreds of times across Sumerian texts, always in context suggesting fundamental principles or powers, yet never with a clear definition that translates easily into modern language. Some researchers interpret the Me as abstract concepts like justice, kingship, or craftsmanship. Others see them as literal objects, tablets or artifacts containing crucial knowledge. Still others suggest they represent something closer to what we might call natural laws, the underlying principles that govern reality itself. What makes the Me particularly intriguing is how the tablets describe their possession and transfer. They aren't abstract qualities that anyone can access through contemplation or divine grace. They're treated as discrete entities that can be owned, stolen, given, or lost. The most famous story involving the Me describes how Inanna, the goddess of love and war, travelled to Eridu to visit Enki. During the visit, Enki became drunk on beer, and in his intoxicated state gave Inanna numerous Mi, which she immediately loaded onto her boat and fled with back to her own city of Uruk. When Enki sobered and realized what he'd done, he sent servants to retrieve the Me, but Inanna had already escaped with her cargo of fundamental knowledge that would forever after reside in Uruk, rather than exclusively in Eridu where Enki had guarded it. This story is recorded with details that feel more historical than mythological. The texts specify which Mi were transferred, listing them in careful order: lordship, godship, the noble and enduring crown, the throne of kingship, the exalted scepter, the noble staff, the sacred office, truth, descent into the underworld and ascent from it, the art of lovemaking, the kissing of the phallus, the art of prostitution, the loud musical instrument, the art of song, eldership, heroship, power, enmity, straightforwardness, the plundering of cities, lamentation, rejoicing of the heart, falsehood, the rebel land, kindness, being on the move, the secure dwelling place, and dozens more. The list goes on with stunning specificity, as if cataloguing actual transferable knowledge or capabilities rather than abstract theological concepts. But here's what makes this particularly relevant to humanity's story. According to multiple Sumerian texts, Enki didn't just allow the me to be stolen by Inanna. He deliberately shared aspects of the me with humans, teaching mortals knowledge that other Anunnaki believed should remain exclusively divine. The tablets record arguments among the Anunnaki about this, debates where Enlil and others accused Enki of giving humanity too much knowledge, of elevating mortals beyond their intended station, of creating a situation that would inevitably lead to conflict between the divine and human realms. One fragmentary text preserves what appears to be Enki's response to these accusations. In it, he argues that humanity's purpose cannot be fulfilled if they remain ignorant, that the work the Anunnaki created humans to perform requires intelligence and skill, that keeping mortals in darkness serves no one's interests. It's a remarkable passage because it presents Enki not as a rebel or troublemaker, but as someone taking a principled stand, arguing that education serves both divine and human interest even if it comes with risks. Yet the text also hints that Enki's fellow Anunnaki weren't convinced, that the sharing of knowledge remained a source of tension, a wound in the relationship between humanity and the divine that never fully healed. The temple at Eridu, Enki's earthly residence, was structured around this role as keeper and sharer of knowledge. Archaeological excavations reveal that the temple complex included what appear to be library rooms, storage areas for tablets, and spaces that scholars interpret as teaching chambers where priests received instruction. The temple wasn't just a place of worship, but a center of learning, and the learning that happened there, according to Sumerian tradition, flowed from Enki himself, who taught humans mathematics, astronomy, metallurgy, agriculture, medicine, and all the arts that distinguish civilization from barbarism. Yet the tablets also preserve a darker current in these stories of knowledge transfer. They hint that some of what Enki taught was meant to remain secret, that certain knowledge carried dangers that humans weren't equipped to handle, that the line between elevating humanity and endangering them was thinner than Enki perhaps believed. References appear to forbidden teachings, to knowledge that brought with it obligations and risks, to understanding that changed those who possessed it in ways that couldn't be undone. The texts are frustratingly vague about specifics, but they consistently suggest that knowledge itself could be dangerous, that some of what the Anunnaki understood was meant to remain beyond human reach, not out of selfish hoarding, but out of genuine concern for human safety. And woven through all these stories is the implication that the knowledge Enki shared ultimately contributed to the transformation of human-divine relations, that the education he provided gave humans capabilities that changed the fundamental balance between mortal and immortal, that by teaching humanity to understand what the Anunnaki understood, he made it impossible for the old relationship to continue. The consequences of this knowledge transfer ripple through Mesopotamian mythology, surfacing in story after story about humans who reached too far, understood too much, achieved what should have remained beyond mortal capability. The most famous of these stories, the one that has echoed through 3 millennia to reach the modern world, is the tale of a king who refused to accept the boundary between human and divine, who sought the one secret the Anunnaki guarded most jealously. When George Smith first translated the flood narrative from the Epic of Gilgamesh in 1872, the Victorian audience was shocked to discover that the biblical flood had a much older Mesopotamian precedent. But within the full epic lies another story, one that speaks directly to humanity's relationship with the Anunnaki. Gilgamesh, the king of Uruk, was described as 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, a hybrid being that suggests intimate connections between the Anunnaki and humanity. After the death of his friend Enkidu, Gilgamesh becomes obsessed with discovering the secret of immortality, the one thing that separates the divine from the mortal. His quest takes him to Utnapishtim, the Mesopotamian Noah, who survived the Great Flood and was granted eternal life by the gods. But what Gilgamesh learns isn't how to become immortal, but why immortality was removed from human reach. The epic presents Gilgamesh as the ideal of human achievement, a king so capable, so strong, so wise that he embodied the pinnacle of what mortals could become. Yet even with his partial divine heritage, even with all his strength and wisdom, even with resources and determination beyond what any ordinary human could muster, he ultimately fails in his quest for immortality. The epic doesn't present this failure as tragic flaw or moral lesson about accepting one's limitations. It presents it as revelation, as if Gilgamesh's journey was meant to teach him something more profound than how to live forever. The tablets describe Gilgamesh's journey in vivid detail. He travels beyond the known world, through darkness that has never seen light, across waters that no mortal has crossed, seeking Utnapishtim, who alone among humans achieved what Gilgamesh desires. When he finally reaches Utnapishtim's dwelling at the edge of the world, the immortal flood survivor tells Gilgamesh his story. The gods decided to destroy humanity with a great flood, Utnapishtim explains, but Enki, contrary to the will of the other Anunnaki, warned him to build a boat and save his family and the seed of all living things. When the flood subsided and Utnapishtim made offerings to the gods, they were so moved by his survival and devotion that they granted him and his wife immortality, removing them from the mortal world to live forever at the edge of the ocean, where time no longer touches them. But here's the crucial revelation. Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh that this gift of immortality was unique, a singular response to extraordinary circumstances that will never be repeated. The gods made a decision after the flood, he explains, a choice about the fundamental nature of human existence. Immortality was removed from human possibility not as punishment but as definition. Humanity would be mortal. That mortality would define and limit them. The boundary between divine and human would be maintained not through ignorance or servitude, but through the simple fact that humans die, and the Anunnaki do not. Yet the epic doesn't end with this revelation. Utnapishtim, perhaps taking pity on Gilgamesh's despair, tells him about a plant growing at the bottom of the cosmic ocean, a plant that restores youth, though it cannot prevent eventual death. Gilgamesh dives to the ocean floor, retrieves the plant, and begins his journey home, planning to test it on an old man in Uruk before using it himself. But while Gilgamesh bathes in a cool pool during the journey, a serpent smells the plant's fragrance, emerges from the water and eats it, shedding its skin and slithering away renewed. Gilgamesh returns to Uruk empty-handed, having lost even the limited gift of restored youth, carrying only the knowledge that immortality is forever beyond human reach. The epic ends with Gilgamesh standing before the walls of Uruk, the great city he built, and finding consolation not in eternal life but in eternal legacy. The walls will stand long after he's gone. The civilization he fostered will continue. His name will be remembered. This is the immortality available to humans, the text suggests. Immortality through achievement and memory, rather than endless personal existence. Yet beneath this apparent acceptance lies something more troubling, a sense that this limitation wasn't natural or inevitable, but imposed, that humanity was deliberately designed with mortality as a defining constraint, that the Anunnaki made conscious choices about what humans would and wouldn't be allowed to become. The tablets preserve fragments suggesting there was once greater possibility that early humans or certain exceptional individuals possessed longer lifespans, greater capabilities, that the rigid boundary between mortal and divine wasn't always so absolute. The Sumerian king list records rulers who reigned for thousands of years before the flood, lifespans that gradually shortened afterward until reaching normal human duration. These records are usually dismissed as mythology, yet they preserve a memory of transformation, of human potential that was progressively limited, of capabilities that were removed or restricted as human civilization developed. And woven through all these stories is the question that Gilgamesh's epic raises but never fully answers. Why was immortality removed from human reach? Was it simply to maintain the distinction between divine and mortal? Or was there something more, some danger in human immortality that the Anunnaki recognized? Some reason why mortality had to be enforced? The tablets hint at answers but never state them plainly, as if the true explanation was considered too dangerous or too destabilizing to record clearly. Even in texts meant to preserve the most important truths about human existence, what the tablets do make clear is that humanity kept pushing against their limitations, kept seeking knowledge and capabilities that the Anunnaki had tried to place beyond their reach, kept discovering ways to achieve what they were told was impossible. Archaeological excavations across Mesopotamia have revealed a pattern that makes historians deeply uncomfortable. At several points in Sumerian and Akkadian history, there are sudden technological advances that appear to have no developmental history, no experimental phase, no gradual improvement. Bronze metallurgy appears fully developed. Advanced irrigation systems spring into existence with mathematical precision. Architectural techniques show no learning curve. The potter's wheel, the plough, the written word, all emerge in forms that suggest they were introduced rather than invented. For scholars committed to the idea of gradual human development, these technological punctuations are explained away as evidence lost to time or rapid learning, but the tablets themselves offer a different explanation. These were gifts from the Anunnaki, knowledge transferred from the divine to the human realm during the time when gods and mortals worked side by side. Consider bronze metallurgy, one of the defining technologies of Mesopotamian civilization. Creating bronze requires combining copper and tin in precise ratios, heating them to specific temperatures, and controlling the cooling process to produce metal with desired properties. This isn't something you stumble upon by accident. It requires understanding of chemistry, metallurgy, and materials science that should take generations to develop through experimentation. You need to discover that certain rocks contain extractable metals. You need to figure out how to build furnaces that reach high enough temperatures. You need to learn that combining metals creates alloys with properties different from either component. You need to develop techniques for casting, forging, and tempering. Each of these steps requires knowledge built upon previous knowledge, a chain of discoveries that stretches across time. Yet when bronze metallurgy appears in the archaeological record of Mesopotamia, it appears essentially complete. The earliest bronze artifacts show sophisticated alloy ratios, advanced casting techniques, and metallurgical understanding that suggests the makers already knew what they were doing. There's no progression from crude experimental metalwork to refined technique. The technology appears already mature, as if the knowledge required to produce bronze had been transferred complete rather than discovered incrementally. The same pattern appears with irrigation engineering. The canal systems that made Mesopotamian agriculture possible weren't simple ditches that gradually improved. The earliest irrigation work shows sophisticated understanding of hydrology, gradient calculation, water flow dynamics, and long-term maintenance requirements. They demonstrate knowledge of how to move water across landscapes, how to prevent silting and erosion, how to distribute water fairly among multiple users, how to build systems that will function reliably for generations. This is engineering knowledge that should require extensive trial and error to accumulate, yet it appears in the archaeological record already well developed, as if the builders had learned from teachers who already understood the principles they were applying. Architectural techniques show the same troubling pattern. The earliest monumental architecture in Mesopotamia demonstrates sophisticated knowledge of structural engineering, load-bearing, foundation construction, and building materials. There's no primitive stage of building that collapses or fails. These structures stand because their builders understood from the beginning how to make them stand. Even the mud brick construction that defined Mesopotamian architecture required knowledge that shouldn't be immediately available. Which clay works best for bricks? What ratio of straw to clay provides optimal strength? How long bricks need to dry? What patterns of laying create the most stable walls? How to construct foundations that resist subsidence in alluvial soil? Yet the earliest mud brick structures already embody this knowledge, suggesting their builders had access to information accumulated over periods longer than the archaeological record shows. The Sumerian tablets themselves explicitly state that these technologies came from the Anunnaki. The texts describe Enki teaching humans metallurgy, Enlil instructing them in agriculture, various gods imparting skills in different crafts and arts. These aren't presented as metaphorical stories about gradual human development. They're recorded as historical events, moments when divine teachers transferred specific knowledge to human students, who then applied that knowledge to transform their material conditions. The tablets list the me that relate to each craft, the fundamental principles that must be understood to practice each technology successfully, and they credit the Anunnaki with possessing these me and choosing to share them with humanity. For modern scholars, accepting these accounts at face value is impossible. The gradual development of technology through human innovation is fundamental to how we understand cultural evolution. Yet the archaeological evidence keeps presenting these uncomfortable punctuations, these moments when new capabilities appear without visible developmental history, these technological leaps that suggest knowledge transfer rather than indigenous discovery. And while scholars work to explain these patterns through mechanisms like lost evidence, rapid cultural diffusion, or accelerated learning during specific historical periods, the explanations often feel strained, as if we're working hard to avoid acknowledging what the evidence seems to be showing. But perhaps most troubling is the implication these technological patterns carry. If the technologies were indeed taught rather than discovered, if the Anunnaki did transfer knowledge to early humans, then human development wasn't autonomous but guided. Not indigenous innovation but education from teachers who already possessed the knowledge they were sharing. And if that's true, then the increasing sophistication of human technology represents not just human cleverness, but successful learning, humans mastering what they were taught and perhaps beginning to build upon it, to innovate beyond their original instruction, to become not just students but independent thinkers capable of discovering knowledge the Anunnaki hadn't specifically taught them. And in one of the most revealing texts from the ancient world, we find evidence that this transition from taught students to independent innovators was exactly what the Anunnaki had simultaneously hoped for and feared. One of the most revealing texts from ancient Mesopotamia is the Atrahasis epic, a Babylonian narrative that preserves much older Sumerian traditions. According to this text, humanity wasn't created out of love or artistic impulse, but out of necessity. The Anunnaki, the text explains, were exhausted from the labor of digging canals, building cities, and maintaining the irrigation systems of Mesopotamia. The lesser Anunnaki rebelled against the toil, and in response the solution was to create humanity as a workforce to bear the burden of civilization building. But here's what makes the Atrahasis epic so intriguing. It describes this creation in technical terms, involving the mixture of divine essence with earth, a process that sounds less like metaphorical creation and more like deliberate genetic engineering. And it records that this solution, humanity itself, eventually became more complex than the Anunnaki anticipated. The epic opens with a description of the world before humanity existed. The Anunnaki were divided into two groups: the senior gods who directed affairs, and the Igigi, lesser Anunnaki who performed the actual physical labor required to maintain the world. For 40 years, the text specifies, the Igigi dug the Tigris River. For 40 more years, they dug the Euphrates. They excavated canals, built irrigation works, constructed cities and temples, performing endless manual labor under the direction of Enlil and the senior Anunnaki. The text describes their work in detail that feels more like historical chronicle than mythology, specifying tools, locations, duration, and the growing exhaustion and resentment of the workers. Eventually the Igigi could bear no more. They burned their tools, marched to Enlil's temple in the middle of the night, and surrounded the building, demanding relief from their burdens. The senior Anunnaki convened an emergency council, trying to decide how to respond to this unprecedented rebellion. Enki proposed a solution: create a new being, a worker who would take over the labor and free the Anunnaki from physical toil. This new being would be intelligent enough to use tools and follow instructions, but would remain mortal and limited, incapable of challenging divine authority. The text then describes the creation process in terms that have puzzled translators for generations. It involves taking clay from over the Abzu, the subterranean freshwater, and mixing it with the essence of a slain god, specifically using the god's blood and flesh. A birth goddess, Nintu or Beletili, is called upon to perform the creation, mixing the materials while reciting incantations. The text specifies that divine essence is needed to give the creation intelligence and capability, that without this the clay would remain merely clay. The process is described with technical precision, as if recording a procedure rather than inventing a myth, and the text carefully notes that multiple attempts were needed before the creation was successful, suggesting experimentation and refinement rather than instantaneous divine miracle. When the creation finally succeeds, humans begin to multiply and spread across Mesopotamia, taking over the labor that had exhausted the Igigi. The Anunnaki retire from physical work, content to let their created workforce maintain civilization while they focus on governance and decision-making. For a time, the arrangement functions perfectly. Humans perform the work they were designed for, and the Anunnaki oversee them with satisfied approval. But then the text records something the Anunnaki hadn't anticipated. Humans became too successful. They multiplied too rapidly, spread too widely, grew too numerous. The text describes the earth groaning under the weight of human population, the noise of humanity disturbing the sleep of the gods, the sheer number of mortals beginning to concern the Anunnaki who had created them. What was meant to be a controlled solution to a labor problem had become something else, a new force in this world that couldn't be easily managed or contained. Enlil proposed solutions. He sent plague to reduce human numbers. He sent drought to limit their expansion. He attempted to control human population through natural disasters and hardship. But each time, according to the text, Enki intervened, teaching humans how to survive, providing them with knowledge to overcome the challenges Enlil imposed. Enki taught them medicine to resist disease, irrigation techniques to overcome drought, agricultural innovations to produce food even in difficult conditions. The text presents this as an ongoing conflict among the Anunnaki themselves, a disagreement about whether humanity should be controlled or educated, limited or allowed to develop. Finally, Enlil convinced the Council of Anunnaki to implement a final solution, a great flood that would wipe out humanity entirely, allowing the gods to start fresh, or simply abandon the experiment of human creation. The Anunnaki swore an oath not to warn humans of the coming catastrophe, agreeing to let the flood destroy everything without giving mortals a chance to prepare or escape. Yet Enki, bound by his oath not to directly tell humans what was coming, found a loophole. He spoke to the wall of the reed house where Atrahasis slept, describing the coming flood within Atrahasis's hearing without technically breaking his vow. Atrahasis understood, built a boat according to Enki's indirectly provided specifications, loaded it with his family and animals, and survived the deluge that destroyed the rest of humanity. The epic's conclusion is remarkable for its honesty about divine limitations. When the flood subsided and the Anunnaki smelled the offerings Atrahasis made, they realized they were hungry. Without humans to provide offerings, to maintain temples, to perform the labor of civilization, the Anunnaki discovered they actually needed humanity. The text records them gathering around Atrahasis's offering like flies, desperately hungry, acknowledging that destroying humanity entirely had been a mistake. Enlil was furious that someone survived, but the other Anunnaki, hungry and beginning to understand the implications of a world without humans, sided with Enki. Humanity would be allowed to continue, though with new limitations, shorter lifespans, restrictions on reproduction, mortality firmly enforced. What makes the Atrahasis epic so significant is its portrayal of humanity not as helpless creatures dependent on divine whim, but as beings whose capabilities exceeded their creator's expectations. Humans weren't just passive workers. They were intelligent, adaptable, capable of learning from Enki's teachings and applying that knowledge to survive challenges meant to destroy them. The text presents human development as a source of both pride and concern for the Anunnaki, suggesting that the beings created to serve had evolved into something more complex, more capable, more independent than originally intended. And perhaps most significant, the epic explicitly states that this transformation worried the Anunnaki, that human development represented not just success but danger, that mortals achieving too much capability became a problem requiring divine intervention to control. This same theme surfaces in another famous Mesopotamian tradition, one that would eventually echo through biblical narrative to reach the modern world. The biblical story of the Tower of Babel has its roots in Mesopotamian tradition, specifically in accounts of ziggurats and humanity's attempt to reach the realm of the gods. But the archaeological reality is even more interesting than the myth. Ziggurats weren't just temples, they were astronomical observatories, administrative centers, and in some sense bridges between earth and sky, between human and divine realms. The Etemenanki in Babylon, which likely inspired the Babel narrative, was a structure of staggering ambition, rising nearly 300 feet into the Mesopotamian sky. According to tradition, its construction represented humanity's growing confidence, their increasing understanding of engineering, mathematics, and organization. But the story also preserves a memory of something else. The moment when human capability reached a threshold that concerned the divine, when mortals demonstrated they could achieve what was previously reserved for gods alone. The name Etemenanki means a title that captures its intended purpose as a connection point between terrestrial and celestial realms. The structure wasn't just tall, it was precisely engineered, with 7 ascending levels corresponding to the 7 celestial bodies known to Mesopotamian astronomy: the Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Each level was painted a different colour associated with its corresponding celestial body, creating a structure that served as both architectural marvel and cosmological model, a physical representation of the universe built by human hands in the heart of Babylon. Archaeological excavations have revealed the foundation of the Etemenanki, and even the ruins demonstrate the ambition of the project. The base covered approximately 300 feet on each side, a massive square platform supporting the ascending levels. Robert Coldaway, the German archaeologist who excavated Babylon in the early 20th century, found bricks stamped with Nebuchadnezzar's name boasting about the ziggurat's reconstruction, describing how he had raised its top to rival heaven itself. Ancient texts provide measurements and descriptions that allow scholars to reconstruct the ziggurat's original appearance. A towering structure with a temple at its summit where, according to tradition, the god Marduk descended to meet with priests and receive offerings. But here's what makes the Etemenanki significant beyond its impressive engineering. Its construction represented a statement about human capability, a demonstration that mortals could build structures reaching toward the divine realm, could organize the labor and resources necessary for projects of staggering ambition, could execute architectural plans requiring generations to complete. The ziggurat wasn't just a temple, it was proof of concept, evidence that humans had mastered the knowledge needed to reshape their world according to their own vision, to build not just for practical purposes but for symbolic ones, to create structures that declared human capability and ambition to anyone who looked upon them. The biblical Babel narrative remembers this ambition but frames it as hubris. In Genesis, humans speak one language and work together to build a city with a tower reaching to heaven, explicitly stating their desire to make a name for themselves and avoid being scattered across the earth. God sees what they're building and says something remarkable. Behold, they are one people, and they have all one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. The statement acknowledges human capability, recognizing that unified humanity with shared language and purpose possesses almost unlimited potential. The response is to confuse their language and scatter them, not as punishment but as limitation, as a way to ensure that human capability remains manageable, that mortal achievement doesn't exceed boundaries the divine has established. The Mesopotamian versions of this story are more fragmentary but preserve similar themes. They describe a time when humanity spoke one language, when communication was perfect and cooperation unlimited, when humans could organize collectively to achieve goals that would be impossible for fragmented groups. They describe the construction of great ziggurats as humanity reaching toward divine realms, attempting to access knowledge and spaces that had been reserved for the Anunnaki. And they hint that this reaching concerned the gods, that human achievement approaching divine capability created a situation that required divine response. Some texts suggest the Anunnaki viewed these developments with mixed feelings. Pride that their created servants had learned so well, had taken the knowledge provided them and built upon it to achieve impressive results. But also concern that humans were developing too quickly, achieving too much, that the gap between mortal and divine was narrowing in ways that hadn't been anticipated when humanity was first created. The tablets preserve fragments of debates among the Anunnaki about how to respond, whether to encourage human development or limit it, whether to provide more knowledge or withhold it, whether humanity's growing capability represented success or danger. The linguistic aspect of the Babel story is particularly intriguing when examined through the lens of Mesopotamian reality. Cuneiform could indeed be used to write multiple languages: Sumerian, Akkadian, Hittite, Elamite, and others. Yet all these languages shared the same script, the same writing system invented in Sumer and spread across the ancient Near East. In a sense, cuneiform provided a common written language even when spoken languages differed, a unifying technology that allowed diverse peoples to communicate complex ideas across linguistic boundaries. The proliferation of spoken languages might represent not divine intervention, but natural cultural development, yet the persistence of cuneiform as a shared written system meant that knowledge could still be transmitted, that learning developed in one culture could be recorded and transferred to others, that human intellectual development could continue even with linguistic diversity. And perhaps that was the point. Perhaps the Babel narrative preserves memory not of supernatural linguistic confusion, but of a recognition that humanity had developed systems for preserving and transmitting knowledge that would allow continuous development regardless of cultural or linguistic divisions. Writing itself was the tower, the technology that reached toward heaven, the tool that gave humans godlike ability to transcend time and space, to speak across generations, to accumulate knowledge beyond what any single human lifetime could contain. If that interpretation holds, then the Babel story isn't about pride punished, but about a threshold crossed, a moment when human capability reached a point of no return, when the knowledge humans possessed and the systems they'd developed for preserving and expanding that knowledge meant they could no longer be controlled through limitation of information. The Anunnaki could confuse languages, could scatter peoples, could impose limitations, but humans now possessed the tools to continue developing regardless, to build upon the foundation of knowledge they'd accumulated, to progress toward understanding that approached what their divine teachers had once exclusively possessed. And in that progression, in that steady accumulation of human knowledge and capability, lay the seeds of transformation that would eventually change everything about the relationship between mortals and those they had once called gods. The Sumerian king list, one of the most important documents from ancient Mesopotamia, records the rulers of Sumer before and after the Great Flood. But the Prediluvian section presents a problem that has puzzled scholars since the list was first translated. It records 8 kings who ruled for impossibly long periods, 28,800 years, 36,000 years, even 43,200 years. Conventional scholarship dismisses these numbers as symbolic or mythological, but the tablets record them with the same matter-of-fact precision they use for historical kings, whose reigns we can verify. More intriguing still, these antediluvian kings are described as having direct relationships with the Anunnaki, ruling not just with divine mandate but with divine presence. After the flood, recorded reigns dropped to more human timescales, hundreds of years at most, then gradually declining to normal human lifespans. The king list exists in multiple copies, discovered at different sites across Mesopotamia, and the remarkable thing is that they all preserve essentially the same information about these antediluvian rulers. The text begins with the phrase, "when kingship was lowered from heaven," already suggesting that political authority itself was a divine gift rather than human innovation. Then it methodically lists the cities where kingship resided, and the kings who ruled from each, providing their names and the precise length of their reigns in a format identical to how it records historically verifiable later rulers. The first king, Alulim, ruled in Eridu for 28,800 years. Alalja, also of Eridu, ruled for 36,000 years. The list continues through 8 kings spanning 5 cities: Eridu, Bad Tibia, Larak, Sipa, and Shurupak. The total length of these 8 reigns amounts to 241,200 years, a duration that encompasses geological epochs rather than historical periods. Then the text states simply, "Then the flood swept over." After this dividing line, the king list resumes with the first dynasty after the flood, beginning with kings whose reigns are measured in hundreds rather than thousands of years. What troubles scholars about these numbers is their specificity. If they were purely symbolic or metaphorical, you'd expect round numbers, multiples of significant values, patterns that clearly indicate mythological rather than historical intent. But the antediluvian reigns are recorded with the same precision as later historical rulers: 28,800, not 30,000, 43,200, not 45,000. The scribes who compiled the king list treated these figures as data to be preserved accurately, not as myths to be embellished or approximated. Some researchers have attempted to find mathematical or astronomical patterns in the numbers, suggesting they encode knowledge about cosmic cycles or calendrical calculations. Others propose that the figures use a different numerical system than we're interpreting, that what we read as years might represent months or seasons or some other unit of time. Yet none of these explanations fully resolve the problem, because the text itself transitions seamlessly from these vast pre-Diluvian reigns to post-flood reigns that match known historical chronology, using the same terminology and format throughout, suggesting the scribes understood themselves to be recording continuous history, rather than switching between myth and fact. What's particularly intriguing is how the king list describes the transition. The post-flood reigns are still superhuman by modern standards. The first king after the deluge, Jusha of Kish, ruled for 1,200 years, but they're no longer the geological timescales of the antediluvian period. And with each successive dynasty, reign lengths continue to decline, gradually approaching normal human lifespans. By the time the king list reaches rulers, we can verify through other historical sources the reign lengths match what we'd expect from mortal kings. It's as if the text preserves memory of a progressive limitation, a gradual shortening of human lifespan from something approaching immortality down to the 70 or 80 years we recognize as normal human existence. The antediluvian kings aren't just noted for their impossible longevity, but for their direct connection to the Anunnaki. Fragments of other texts describe these early rulers as intermediaries between divine and human realms, kings who received instruction directly from the gods, and governed according to principles the Anunnaki taught them. One text describes the seventh antediluvian king, Enmedurenna of Sippar, as having been taken into the assembly of the Anunnaki, where he learned the secrets of divination, the mysteries of heaven and earth, skills he was commanded to teach to humanity. The description sounds remarkably similar to the later Babylonian story of Adapa, a human who was granted wisdom by Enki but denied immortality, or the biblical Enoch who walked with God and was taken into heaven without experiencing death. These stories of antediluvian humans who interacted directly with the divine, who possessed knowledge beyond normal human capacity, who lived for periods that blurred the line between mortal and immortal existence, all suggest memory of a time when the boundary between human and Anunnaki was more permeable, when certain humans achieved status that elevated them closer to divine level. And the consistent placement of this era before the Great Flood suggests that the deluge served as more than physical catastrophe. It was a dividing line, a moment when something fundamental changed about human possibility, when capabilities that had been available to exceptional individuals were removed or restricted, when the relationship between mortal and divine was redefined with stricter boundaries and clearer limitations. The question that haunts researchers examining the king list is simple but profound. What are these numbers trying to tell us? Are they purely symbolic, attempts to express the antiquity of civilization through impressive figures? Are they corrupted memories of real chronology, historical data distorted through generations of transmission? Or do they preserve something else, some understanding about early human existence that doesn't fit our assumptions about the development of civilization and the capabilities of our ancestors? The tablets themselves offer no explanation, recording the figures with the same matter-of-fact precision they use for everything else, as if expecting future readers to understand what the numbers mean, what truth they encode about the deep past. And perhaps the answer lies not in the numbers themselves, but in the context they provide. The suggestion that human history includes periods of transformation, moments when human capability and human limitation shifted in ways that left traces in the collective memory preserved through texts like the King List. Yet for all the mysteries encoded in king lists and mythological texts, some of the most revealing evidence about Anunnaki influence comes not from grand narratives, but from the systematic records preserved in temple archives. Nippur held a unique position in Mesopotamian civilization. Unlike other cities that rose and fell with the fortunes of war and politics, Nippur remained a religious center for thousands of years, its temples continuously maintained even when political power shifted elsewhere. And it was at Nippur that archaeologists discovered one of the richest collections of cuneiform tablets ever found, including texts that describe the assembly of the Anunnaki, the structure of their hierarchy, and the decisions they made regarding humanity. Among these tablets are fragmentary texts that hint at debates among the Anunnaki, disagreements about whether humanity should be educated or kept ignorant, whether certain knowledge should be shared or withheld. These aren't the records of distant, unknowable gods, but of beings engaged in political decisions with profound consequences for human development. The excavations at Nippur, conducted by the University of Pennsylvania beginning in 1888 and continuing for decades, revealed a city that had been continuously occupied for thousands of years. The Temple of Enlil, the chief god of the Sumerian pantheon, dominated the site, and in the ruins of this temple and its associated buildings, archaeologists discovered thousands of cuneiform tablets spanning the entire history of Mesopotamian civilization. These weren't random texts, but systematic archives, libraries where priests had carefully preserved knowledge across millennia, protecting documents that detailed every aspect of Mesopotamian religion, governance, and learning. Among the most important tablets from Nippur are texts that describe the Anunnaki as an organized hierarchy, a structured assembly with ranks, roles, and specific domains of authority. These texts name individual Anunnaki, specify their relationships, describe their responsibilities, and record their decisions with bureaucratic precision. Reading these tablets feels less like reading mythology and more like reading administrative records from a complex organization, minutes from meetings where policies were debated and decisions were made that would affect the course of human civilization. One fragmentary text preserves what appears to be a debate among the Anunnaki about human education. The tablet is damaged, with sections missing, but enough remains to capture the essence of the disagreement. One faction, apparently led by Enlil, argues that humans should be given only the knowledge necessary to perform their designated tasks, that excessive education creates risk, that mortals understanding too much will inevitably challenge divine authority. Another faction, with Enki as its most vocal advocate, contends that human potential should be developed, that education serves both divine and human interests, that keeping mortals ignorant ultimately limits their usefulness, and creates resentment that causes more problems than knowledge would. The text doesn't record a clear resolution to this debate, suggesting it was an ongoing point of contention among the Anunnaki rather than a settled question. But the very existence of such a debate is remarkable, because it presents the Anunnaki not as omniscient beings with perfect knowledge of what should be done, but as decision-makers weighing competing considerations, trying to determine the right course of action without perfect foresight of consequences. These are beings with power and knowledge beyond human capacity, yes, but they're beings who disagree among themselves, who must deliberate and compromise, who make choices they later question. Other tablets from Nippur describe the structure of Anunnaki society in detail that scholars have spent decades trying to fully understand. There was a council of 7 who made major decisions, sometimes called the 7 who decree fate. There was a larger assembly of 50, the great Anunnaki who attended councils and witnessed important proclamations. And below these were ranks of lesser Anunnaki with specific responsibilities, those who governed celestial phenomena, those who oversaw terrestrial domains, those who managed the boundary between divine and human realms. The texts describe this hierarchy with the precision of organizational charts, specifying lines of authority and spheres of influence in ways that suggest a complex, structured society rather than a simple pantheon of gods with vague divine attributes. Some tablets record specific decisions made by the Anunnaki Council. One fragmentary text describes a decree limiting human lifespan, specifying that mortals would no longer be permitted to live for centuries, but would be restricted to shorter durations, though the tablet is too damaged to clearly read the specific limit imposed. Another tablet mentions restrictions on human access to certain knowledge, particularly understanding related to the me, those fundamental principles that governed reality itself. These aren't presented as arbitrary divine whims, but as considered decisions, responses to specific situations, policies implemented to address problems the Anunnaki perceived in human development. The texts also preserve hints of dissent within Anunnaki ranks, suggestions that not all decisions were unanimous, that implementing policies regarding humanity sometimes required overruling objections from Anunnaki, who favored different approaches. Enki appears repeatedly in these contexts as the dissenting voice, the Anunnaki, who consistently advocates for human development even when other gods favor limitation and control. Yet even Enki's advocacy has boundaries. Some tablets suggest he agreed that certain knowledge must remain beyond human reach, that some me were too dangerous to share, that complete equality between human and divine would create instabilities that served no one's interests. What makes the Nippur tablets so significant is that they present divine governance as a political process, complete with debates, compromises, factions, and evolving policies. The Anunnaki aren't portrayed as mysterious beings operating according to inscrutable divine logic. They're portrayed as administrators making practical decisions about how to manage a civilization, how to balance competing priorities, how to respond to the unexpected development and growing capability of the human population they had created. and woven through these administrative records is evidence that human development consistently surprised the Anunnaki, that mortals kept achieving more than expected, learning faster than anticipated, discovering knowledge they weren't meant to possess. One particularly intriguing tablet mentions something called the Secret of the Gods, a piece of knowledge or understanding that the Anunnaki possessed and agreed must never be shared with humanity. The tablet doesn't specify what this secret was, only that its preservation required vigilance, that certain humans had come dangerously close to discovering it, that maintaining the boundary between divine and human knowledge on this particular point was considered essential. The text breaks off before providing details, leaving modern scholars to wonder what knowledge the Anunnaki guarded so carefully, what understanding they believed would fundamentally alter the relationship between mortal and divine if humans ever gained access to it. And perhaps the answer to that question lies in the knowledge systems themselves, in the mathematics and science that the Anunnaki supposedly taught, but which humans then developed beyond their original instruction. Sumerian mathematics was sophisticated in ways that surprise modern researchers. They used a base 60 system that we still preserve in our measurement of time and angles. They understood geometric principles, could calculate areas and volumes, possessed sophisticated algebra, and worked with mathematical concepts that wouldn't be rediscovered until much later in human history. But here's the mystery. There's no evidence of this mathematical system developing gradually. The oldest mathematical tablets show the system fully formed, already sophisticated, as if it were introduced whole rather than discovered piece by piece over generations. Eleanor Robson, a scholar of ancient mathematics at the University of Cambridge, has noted that Sumerian mathematics appears unnaturally mature in its earliest attestations, with a conceptual sophistication that usually requires centuries of intellectual refinement. The base 60 system itself is remarkable for its mathematical elegance. 60 is highly divisible, with factors of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30, making it ideal for calculations involving fractions and divisions. This isn't the kind of numerical base you'd expect a developing culture to stumble upon randomly. The more obvious choices for counting systems are base 10, derived from fingers, or base 20, using fingers and toes. Base 60 requires recognizing abstract mathematical properties and deliberately choosing a system that facilitates complex calculation rather than simple counting. Yet in the earliest Sumerian mathematical tablets, base 60 appears fully implemented, with place value notation, sophisticated algorithms for multiplication and division, and methods for calculating square roots and other complex operations. These aren't primitive attempts at mathematics gradually improving toward functional systems. These are advanced mathematical methods deployed with confidence and precision, suggesting the users already understood the underlying principles and were applying established techniques rather than inventing new approaches through trial and error. The mathematical tablets from ancient Mesopotamia demonstrate knowledge that seems anachronistic for their time period. One tablet, known as Plimpton 322 and housed in Columbia University's collection, contains a sophisticated table of Pythagorean triples, number sets that satisfy the equation a squared plus b squared equals c squared. This tablet dates to approximately 3,800 years ago, more than 1,000 years before Pythagoras lived. The triples listed aren't simple ones like 3, 4, 5. but complex values like 12,709, 13,500, and 18,541, requiring sophisticated algebraic understanding to generate. Other tablets show Sumerian mathematicians could solve quadratic equations, calculate compound interest, work with geometric progressions, and handle problems involving multiple unknowns. They possessed algorithms for division that anticipated methods European mathematicians wouldn't develop until the Renaissance. They understood the relationship between the circumference and diameter of circles, working with values very close to what we call pi. They could calculate the volumes of complex shapes and the areas of irregular polygons. The scope and sophistication of their mathematical knowledge rivals what university mathematics students learn today. Yet this knowledge appears in the archaeological record essentially complete, with no visible development history. Eleanor Robson's observation that Sumerian mathematics appears, quote, 9 captures the essential problem. Mathematical systems typically develop through stages: counting, simple arithmetic, more complex operations, algebraic thinking, geometric understanding, each stage building on previous ones across generations. We can trace this development in other mathematical traditions, watching as Greek mathematics evolved from practical measurement to abstract proof, as Chinese mathematics developed from counting rods to sophisticated algebraic notation, as Islamic mathematics built upon earlier traditions to create new analytical methods. But Sumerian mathematics presents no such developmental sequence. It appears already sophisticated, as if the Sumerians had been taught by instructors who already possessed complete mathematical understanding. The tablets themselves sometimes hint at this pedagogical relationship. Many mathematical texts are structured as teaching materials, presenting problems and solutions in formats that suggest they were used for instruction. Some tablets explicitly state they were copied by Scribble students learning mathematics, and the problems they worked through demonstrate understanding far beyond what simple bookkeeping or administrative calculation would require. These students were being taught not just to calculate but to think mathematically, to understand abstract principles, to work with concepts that had no immediate practical application, but formed the theoretical foundation for advanced mathematical reasoning. One tablet presents a problem that demonstrates this abstract thinking beautifully. It asks, if a canal is dug at a certain width and depth, how long will it take given a specific number of workers? The problem isn't seeking a practical answer, but teaching the student how to set up proportional relationships, how to work with multiple variables, how to reason about quantities that scale with each other. This is mathematical education focused on developing analytical capability, not just training calculators to perform routine operations. And this level of mathematical pedagogy suggests teachers who understood mathematics deeply enough to identify essential principles and design problems that would develop mathematical thinking in their students. According to the tablets themselves, this mathematical knowledge came from the Anunnaki, specifically from Enki and the scribal god Nabu, who taught humans how to calculate, how to understand numerical relationships, how to use mathematics to model and predict natural phenomena. These weren't presented as metaphorical claims. The texts state clearly that divine teachers provided mathematical instruction to humans, that the sophistication of Mesopotamian mathematics derived from knowledge transferred rather than discovered. And if we take these claims seriously, even as historical memory rather than literal fact, they suggest that human mathematical capability developed through education from teachers who already possessed the knowledge they were sharing, who understood mathematics completely enough to teach not just techniques, but underlying principles. But mathematics wasn't the only domain where sophisticated knowledge appeared with suspicious completeness. The mythological texts themselves preserve details that sound less like invention and more like distorted historical memory. The Babylonian creation epic, the Enuma Elish, preserves memories of conflicts that predate humanity itself, wars among the Anunnaki that shaped the cosmos before mortals existed to witness them. The text describes Tiamat, a primordial being of chaos, battling against younger gods led by Marduk, who eventually defeats her and creates the world from her body. But buried within this mythological framework are details that feel less like pure invention and more like distorted memories of real events. The Enuma Elish describes technologies, weapons, and conflicts using language that sounds curiously physical for a divine war, and it places humanity's creation in the aftermath of these conflicts, as if mortals were a solution to problems that predated their existence. Tools created for purposes they weren't initially meant to understand. The epic opens with a description of primordial conditions before anything recognizable as cosmos existed. There was Apsu, the fresh water beneath the earth, and Tiamat, the saltwater ocean, and between them only Mumu, the mist. From their mingling the first gods emerged, generations of divine beings who grew increasingly numerous and active, disturbing the primordial silence with their noise and movement. Apsu became agitated by the younger gods' clamour and plotted to destroy them so peace could be restored. But Ea, the Babylonian equivalent of Enki, learned of this plot and struck first, killing Apsu before he could implement his plan to eliminate the younger generation. This murder enraged Tiamat, who marshalled forces to avenge Apsu's death. The text describes her creating an army of monsters, serpents with venom for blood, dragons clothed in terror, storm demons and fishmen and scorpion men. 11 types of monsters altogether, each more fearsome than the last. She appointed King as commander of her forces and gave him the Tablet of Destinies, a device that apparently granted authority over cosmic forces. The younger gods, terrified of Tiamat's host, searched desperately for a champion who could face her in battle. Marduk, son of Ea, volunteered on condition that if he defeated Tiamat, he would be granted supreme authority over all the gods. The assembly of Anunnaki agreed, and Marduk prepared for battle. The text describes his preparations with curious specificity. He created winds, fashioned them into weapons, made a bow with lightning as its string, carried a mace and a net, and mounted a storm chariot pulled by 4 creatures described with detailed physical characteristics. This doesn't read like abstract mythology. It reads like a description of military preparation, with specific equipment serving specific tactical purposes. The battle itself is described with similar physical detail. Marduk challenged Tiamat to single combat. She opened her mouth to swallow him, and he drove winds into her throat, distending her body. Then he shot an arrow through her mouth into her belly, splitting her heart and killing her. He captured her forces, took the Tablet of Destinies from Kingu, and turned to the practical matter of what to do with Tiamat's corpse. He split her body in 2, using half to create the sky as a barrier holding back her waters, the other half to form the earth. From her eyes he made the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. From other body parts he fashioned geographical features, creating the world humans would inhabit from the remains of this defeated primordial being. Then came the question of who would serve the gods, who would maintain the world Marduk had created. The text records that the assembly of Anunnaki decided to create humans for this purpose, using the blood of King Yu, the defeated commander of Tiamat's forces, mixed with clay. The description emphasizes that divine blood was necessary to give humans intelligence sufficient for the work they would perform, that without this the creation would be merely mindless clay. Humans were created specifically to bear the burden of maintaining civilization so the Anunnaki could rest, a purpose that matches what other texts like the Atrahasis epic describe. What makes the Enuma Elish particularly intriguing is how it presents creation not as divine art but as practical problem solving in the aftermath of conflict. The world isn't made beautiful for its own sake but constructed from available materials following a victory that left one faction of gods supreme over others. Humanity isn't created from love but manufactured to serve specific functions. The entire narrative has a utilitarian quality that feels more like engineering than theology, as if the text preserves memory of actual decisions made by actual beings facing practical problems that required pragmatic solutions. Some of the details are particularly curious when examined closely. The Tablet of Destinies that Tiamat gave King and Marduk later claimed appears in multiple Mesopotamian texts as a device that confers authority over cosmic forces, suggesting some kind of technology or mechanism rather than abstract authority. The specific creatures and weapons described in the battle aren't vague mythological elements, but detailed enough that artists could and did depict them in reliefs and cylinder seals. The geography created from Tiamat's body matches actual Mesopotamian topography, with rivers flowing from mountain sources, skies that hold back cosmic waters, earth that sits between primordial ocean and heavenly realm. The text reads less like abstract cosmology and more like distorted history, as if real events involving real beings had been mythologized through generations of retelling, but still retained enough specific detail to suggest something actual beneath the narrative elaboration. And if the Enuma Elish does preserve distorted memories of actual events, then humanity's creation in the aftermath of conflict among the Anunnaki takes on different significance. It suggests humans were created not just as servants, but as solutions, beings brought into existence to serve purposes related to conflicts and circumstances that predated human awareness. And it raises the question of whether humans were ever meant to remain simple servants, or whether the potential for development and transformation was built into human nature from the beginning, whether the divine blood mixed with clay carried not just intelligence, but capacity for growth that would eventually allow humans to transcend their original purpose. Yet for all the grand mythological narratives and mathematical sophistication, some of the most compelling evidence that humans received instruction from advanced teachers comes from the most practical domain, the knowledge that allowed them to survive and thrive in the harsh Mesopotamian environment. When archaeologists examine the agricultural practices recorded in Sumerian texts, they find knowledge that seems to exceed what trial and error should produce. The Farmer's Almanac, a Sumerian text dating to approximately 3,700 years ago, provides instructions for ploughing, planting, and irrigation with a level of detail that suggests deep understanding of soil chemistry, crop rotation, water management, and even pest control. More remarkably, this agricultural knowledge appears fully developed at the beginning of Sumerian civilization, with no evidence of the centuries of experimentation that farming societies typically require to master their environment. According to Sumerian tradition, agriculture was a gift from the Anunnaki, specifically from Enki and the goddess Ninhursag, who taught humans how to make the desert fertile and turn wild grasses into domesticated grains. The Farmer's Almanac reads like a technical manual written by someone with comprehensive understanding of agricultural principles. It begins with instructions for flooding fields before ploughing, explaining that water must stand on the field until the ground is thoroughly saturated, then be drained before ploughing begins. This isn't obvious knowledge. It reflects understanding that saturated soil breaks up more easily under the plough, that moisture content affects soil structure and workability, that timing the relationship between irrigation and tillage determines how well the field will be prepared for planting. The text continues with specific instructions for ploughing technique. Keep the plough at uniform depth. Make parallel furrows with consistent spacing. Plough 8 times in different directions to thoroughly break up the soil. These aren't general suggestions, but precise technical specifications, and they reflect understanding of how repeated ploughing from different angles creates proper soil structure for planting. The almanac specifies that before seeding, the field should be harrowed 3 times, again showing understanding of soil preparation stages that modern agriculture recognizes as essential. The seeding instructions are equally detailed. The almanac specifies precise seed depth, explains that a seeder should follow the plough to ensure proper placement, and gives specific quantities of seed per unit of land. It warns against using too much seed, which wastes resources and causes seedlings to compete for water and nutrients, but also against using too little, which results in poor yields. Finding the optimal seeding rate requires understanding plant biology, resource competition, and yield optimization, knowledge that typically takes generations of agricultural experimentation to develop. But perhaps most impressively, the Farmer's Almanac includes instructions for pest control, crop rotation, and water management that demonstrate sophisticated ecological understanding. It warns about birds that eat seeds and suggests covering fields or posting watchers. It describes the timing for watering growing plants, explaining that water requirements change as plants mature, that too much water at certain growth stages damages crops, while too little at other stages reduces yields. It discusses how to recognize and respond to plant diseases, how to manage weeds without damaging crops, how to time harvest for optimal grain quality. The text also reveals understanding of soil fertility management. It discusses how continuous planting of the same crop depletes soil, hints at rotation strategies, and mentions using fallow periods to restore land productivity. These concepts reflect recognition of soil chemistry and nutrient cycling that modern agriculture formalized only in the 19th and 20th centuries, yet the Farmer's Almanac discusses them matter-of-factly as established agricultural knowledge. What makes this comprehensive agricultural knowledge particularly mysterious is that it appears at the very beginning of Sumerian civilization. There's no archaeological evidence of centuries of failed harvests, famine, experimentation, and gradual improvement. The earliest Sumerian agriculture already employed sophisticated techniques, already produced reliable surplus, already supported urban populations. The agricultural system appears complete and functional from the start, as if the Sumerians began farming with expert knowledge rather than figuring it out through trial and error. According to Sumerian texts, this wasn't coincidental. Agricultural knowledge was specifically taught by the Anunnaki. Enki taught humans how to channel water, how to make dry land fertile, how to transform wild plants into domesticated crops. Nherseg, whose name means Lady of the Mountain, taught humans about soil, about plant growth, about the relationship between earth and living things. Enlil taught about weather patterns, seasonal cycles, and the timing of agricultural operations. The texts present this agricultural instruction as deliberate education, divine teachers systematically transferring knowledge to human students who would use it to feed growing populations and build civilization. One text describes Enki walking through fields with humans, pointing out which plants are edible, which have medicinal properties, which can be cultivated for fiber or oil. Another describes Ninhursag teaching women how to select seeds for planting, how to recognize plant diseases, how to prepare grain for storage. These aren't abstract theological statements. They're descriptions of teaching and learning, of knowledge transfer from those who understood to those who were learning, of education that transformed humans from hunter-gatherers to farmers capable of supporting urban civilization. And perhaps most significantly, the agricultural knowledge preserved in texts like the Farmer's Almanac represents the foundation that made everything else possible. Without a reliable food surplus, there could be no cities, no specialization of labor, no scribes to invent writing, no priests to observe the stars, no craftsmen to develop metallurgy and architecture. Agriculture was the enabling technology, the knowledge base that allowed civilization to exist. And if that knowledge was taught rather than slowly discovered, if humans learned to farm from teachers who already understood agricultural principles, then civilization itself was built on a foundation of transferred knowledge, on education that accelerated human development beyond what indigenous discovery would have achieved. But in learning these skills, in mastering agriculture and mathematics and astronomy, in building cities and tracking stars and recording knowledge in writing, humans were becoming something more than simple servants, were developing capabilities that would eventually allow them to understand truths their teachers might have preferred remained hidden, truths that would transform everything about the relationship between mortals and those they called divine. Among the clay tablets from ancient Mesopotamia are medical texts that demonstrate knowledge far beyond what we'd expect from a Bronze Age civilization. They describe surgical procedures, pharmaceutical recipes using dozens of plant and mineral ingredients, diagnostic techniques that identify diseases with surprising accuracy, and treatments that often align with what modern medicine would recommend. A tablet from around 2200 BCE lists hundreds of medicinal ingredients and their applications, displaying knowledge that should require millennia of careful experimentation to accumulate. Yet once again, this medical knowledge appears remarkably complete in the earliest records, as if it were learned from teachers who already possess centuries of accumulated wisdom, rather than discovered slowly through human trial and error. The medical tablets from ancient Mesopotamia reveal a sophisticated understanding of disease, treatment, and the human body that scholars find difficult to explain through conventional models of gradual knowledge accumulation. These aren't simple folk remedies or magical incantations, though those elements certainly exist in Mesopotamian medicine. These are systematic diagnostic procedures, detailed pharmaceutical formulas, and treatment protocols that demonstrate empirical observation and accumulated clinical experience. One tablet, known as the Diagnostic Handbook, and attributed to a physician named Esagil Kinapli, who lived around the 11th century BCE but copied from much older sources, provides a systematic approach to medical diagnosis that wouldn't be out of place in a modern medical textbook. It instructs physicians to observe patients carefully, noting the colour of skin and eyes, the character of pulse and breath, the nature of pain and its location, the appearance of bodily excretions. Based on these observations, the text provides differential diagnoses, explaining what combinations of symptoms indicate which diseases and what prognosis physicians should give. The diagnostic precision is remarkable. The text distinguishes between different types of fever based on patterns of onset and resolution. It identifies jaundice and correctly associates it with liver dysfunction. It describes symptoms of what we now recognize as pneumonia, tuberculosis, malaria, and various parasitic infections, providing details specific enough that modern physicians can identify the diseases being described. This level of diagnostic sophistication requires extensive clinical observation, careful record keeping across numerous cases, and analytical thinking that recognizes patterns connecting symptoms to underlying conditions. The pharmaceutical knowledge is equally impressive. Medical tablets list hundreds of substances used in treatment. Plants like myrrh, cedar, cypress, and pine. Minerals including salt, sulfur, and various metal compounds. Animal products like honey, milk, and fats. But these aren't random ingredients applied through superstition. The texts specify precise preparations, which parts of plants to use, how to extract active compounds through infusion or decoction, what carriers to mix with active ingredients for optimal absorption, how to prepare topical versus internal medicines. Many of these pharmaceutical preparations, when analysed by modern chemists and pharmacologists, prove to contain genuinely therapeutic compounds. One tablet describes a treatment for infected wounds using a mixture that includes honey, which we now know has antimicrobial properties, willow bark, which contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin, and mouldy bread, which likely contained naturally occurring antibiotics similar to penicillin. This isn't lucky coincidence. This is empirical medicine. Treatments developed through observation of what actually works, refined through generations of clinical experience. Yet this pharmaceutical knowledge appears essentially complete in the earliest medical texts, suggesting a depth of accumulated experience that should require far longer than the attested history of Mesopotamian civilization to develop. The surgical knowledge preserved in these texts is perhaps most surprising. Tablets describe procedures for setting broken bones, suturing wounds, draining abscesses, removing cataracts from eyes, and even performing basic neurosurgery to relieve cranial pressure. The Code of Hammurabi, dating to approximately 3,700 years ago, includes detailed regulations about surgical fees and liability, implicitly confirming that Mesopotamian physicians regularly performed complex surgical procedures. The code specifies different fees for operating on nobles versus commoners, penalties for surgical failures, and standards of care that surgeons were expected to maintain. Archaeological evidence supports these textual accounts. Skulls found in Mesopotamian contexts show evidence of trepanation, the surgical removal of sections of skull bone, with healing that indicates patients survived these procedures. Skeletal remains show broken bones that were properly set and healed in correct alignment. Dental work, including drilling to treat cavities and even primitive dental prosthetics, appears in archaeological contexts. This wasn't theoretical knowledge recorded in texts but never practiced. This was active surgical medicine, with practitioners skilled enough to perform invasive procedures that patients survived. According to Mesopotamian tradition, medical knowledge, like other forms of knowledge, was a gift from the Anunnaki. The goddess Gula, also called Ninisina, was specifically associated with healing and was described as teaching humans the arts of medicine. Texts record that priests of Gula learned healing in her temples, that medical knowledge was transmitted through temple schools where divine wisdom was preserved and taught to human students. The systematic nature of Mesopotamian medicine, its organization into diagnostic principles and therapeutic protocols, suggests institutional knowledge transmission rather than scattered folk practices, education from teachers who possessed comprehensive medical understanding. But medicine was just one domain where sophisticated knowledge appeared with suspicious completeness. The medical texts were preserved alongside other documents that recorded the catastrophic event that, according to Mesopotamian tradition, fundamentally transformed the relationship between humans and the divine. Almost every Mesopotamian text that mentions the Great Flood describes it as a dividing line in history, a catastrophic event that separated the age when gods walked among humans from the age when mortals had to manage on their own. The Atrahasis epic, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and the Sumerian flood story all preserve versions of this narrative, but they share crucial details. Before the flood, humans and Anunnaki coexisted closely. After the flood, the divine presence becomes distant, mediated through priests and temples rather than direct contact. What's particularly intriguing is that these texts hint the flood wasn't entirely natural. They describe debates among the Anunnaki about whether to save humanity, disagreements about whether mortals had become too numerous, too knowledgeable, too powerful. The flood narrative appears across so many Mesopotamian texts, preserved in so many different versions, that it clearly held central importance in how ancient Mesopotamians understood their own history. This wasn't a minor myth or obscure legend. It was the defining event, the catastrophe that explained why the world they inhabited was different from the world their most ancient traditions described, why the gods who once walked among humans now remained distant, why human lifespans had shortened, why certain knowledge was lost or restricted. The texts preserve remarkably consistent details across different versions. The gods decided to destroy humanity through a great flood. One human, variously named Zeusudra, Atrahasis, or Utnapishtim depending on the version, was warned by a sympathetic god, always identified as Enki, or his Akkadian equivalent Ea. This human built a large boat, loaded it with his family and animals, and survived the deluge while the rest of humanity perished. When the waters subsided, he made offerings to the gods, who smelled the sweet savour and gathered around his sacrifice like flies, desperately hungry after days without human offerings. The gods then debated what to do about the survival of this human family, ultimately deciding to allow humanity to continue, but with new restrictions and limitations. What makes these accounts particularly intriguing is how they describe the decision to send the flood. The Atrahasis epic is most explicit about the reasoning. Humanity had become too numerous, too noisy, too troublesome. The din of human activity disturbed the sleep of the gods. But beneath this surface explanation lie hints of deeper concerns. Fragmentary passages suggest the Anunnaki worried that humans had become too capable, that the beings created to serve were developing beyond their intended limitations, that human population and knowledge had reached levels that threatened to disrupt the established order between divine and mortal realms. The texts describe debates among the Anunnaki about how to respond to human development. Enlil advocated for drastic measures, for limiting or even eliminating humanity to restore divine control and peace. Enki consistently argued for preservation and education, insisting that destroying humanity would be counterproductive, that the Anunnaki actually needed human labour and worship, that managing human development was preferable to preventing it. The flood represents Enlil's solution winning temporarily, a catastrophic reset intended to drastically reduce human population and provide opportunity to reimpose limitations that had eroded during the antediluvian period. But Enki's warning to Atrahasis ensured humanity's survival, and the post-flood debate among the gods resulted in a compromise. Humanity would continue, but with new constraints. The texts specify that human lifespans were shortened, that mortality was more strictly enforced, that reproduction was limited through increased infant mortality and complications of childbirth. These weren't natural developments, but deliberate restrictions, policies implemented by the Anunnaki to ensure that the post-flood human population would remain manageable, that mortals would never again achieve the numbers, longevity, or accumulated knowledge that had characterized the antediluvian period. What's particularly striking is how the texts present the flood not as divine anger at human wickedness, but as response to human success. The problem wasn't that humans were evil, but that they were thriving, multiplying, developing capabilities that made the Anunnaki uncomfortable. The flood was population control, a drastic measure to address what the gods perceived as excessive human development, and the restrictions imposed afterward weren't punishments, but limitations, boundaries established to prevent humans from again reaching levels of capability that had concerned the divine. Some texts hint at even deeper motivations. Fragmentary passages suggest the Anunnaki worried that humans were approaching knowledge they weren't meant to possess, that certain discoveries or understandings threatened to fundamentally alter the relationship between mortal and divine. One damaged tablet mentions secrets that were learned and boundaries that were crossed, suggesting that human intellectual development had progressed into territories the Anunnaki considered dangerous. The flood, in this interpretation, wasn't just about population control, but about resetting human knowledge, destroying accumulated wisdom that had become too advanced, too threatening to divine supremacy. The archaeological record shows evidence of catastrophic flooding in Mesopotamia, though whether these floods match the scale described in the texts remains debated. Excavations at Ur, Shuruppak, and other sites have revealed flood deposits separating earlier from later occupation layers, suggesting that major inundations did occur in the region's deep past. But more significant than the physical evidence of flooding is the cultural memory it preserved, the persistent tradition that something fundamental changed at this boundary, that the world before the flood was different in essential ways from the world after it, that human possibility was greater in the antediluvian period and was deliberately restricted afterward. And woven through all these flood narratives is the implication that while the catastrophe drastically reduced human population and destroyed accumulated knowledge, it didn't entirely succeed in resetting human development. Survivors like Atrahasis carried knowledge across the flood boundary. Enki's intervention ensured that humans retained enough wisdom to rebuild, enough understanding to re-establish civilization. The Anunnaki's attempt to limit humanity through catastrophe was only partially successful, and in the centuries after the flood, humans would again begin accumulating knowledge, building cities, developing capabilities that would eventually force another transformation in divine-human relations. Yet even as humans rebuilt their civilization, they created records of their knowledge and their sky-watching on artifacts that continue to puzzle researchers, artifacts that hint at astronomical understanding that shouldn't have been possible with ancient technology. Among the most beautiful artifacts from ancient Mesopotamia are the cylinder seals, small carved stones that, when rolled across wet clay, create detailed images used to sign documents and mark ownership. But some of these seals contain astronomical imagery that has puzzled researchers for decades. The most famous, Seal VA243 from the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, appears to show a star surrounded by 11 globes, which alternative researcher Zechariah Sitchin controversially interpreted as an ancient map of the solar system, including planets that weren't officially discovered until the modern era. While mainstream scholars dispute Sitchin's interpretation, pointing out that ancient Mesopotamian astronomy used different symbolic systems, the seal nonetheless raises questions about what the Sumerians knew about celestial objects and how they knew it without telescopes. Cylinder seals were ubiquitous in Mesopotamian culture, used by everyone from kings to merchants to scribes to mark ownership and authenticate documents. The seals were typically made from hard stones like lapis lazuli, carnelian or hematite, carved with intricate designs that, when rolled across wet clay, left detailed impressions. The imagery on these seals range from religious scenes showing gods and worshippers to mythological narratives depicting cosmic events, to more mundane images of animals, plants, and geometric patterns. But some seals contain astronomical imagery that seems oddly specific, oddly detailed, as if representing actual celestial observations rather than purely symbolic or decorative designs. Stars are shown, with varying numbers of rays, possibly indicating relative brightness. Arrangements of celestial objects suggest specific configurations, moments in time when particular astronomical alignments occurred. Some seals show celestial bodies in relationships that modern, astronomical software can verify as actual historical conjunctions or configurations, suggesting the seal makers were recording real observations rather than inventing decorative patterns. Seal VA243, the artifact that attracted Sitchin's attention, shows a large star with 6 rays surrounded by 11 smaller spheres of varying sizes. Sitchin interpreted this as a diagram of the solar system, including all known planets, plus one additional body he identified as Nibiru, a hypothetical planet from his alternative historical theories. Mainstream scholars have thoroughly critiqued this interpretation, pointing out that Mesopotamian astronomical symbolism didn't work this way, that the six-rayed star almost certainly represents a deity rather than the sun, that the spheres could represent any number of celestial or symbolic elements rather than specifically planets. Yet even setting aside Sitchin's controversial theories, the seal raises legitimate questions. Why show exactly 11 spheres around a central star? If these aren't meant to represent specific celestial objects, why such precise number? Why vary their sizes in ways that could suggest relative brightness or distance? The seal's creators carved it with obvious care and precision, suggesting the imagery meant something specific to them, encoded information or knowledge they considered worth preserving in permanent form. Other cylinder seals show similar astronomical precision. Some depict the crescent moon with a star positioned between the horns of the crescent, a configuration that occurs during specific lunar phases and particular times of year. Some show multiple celestial bodies in arrangements that suggest actual conjunctions. Some include what appear to be astronomical instruments or measuring devices, tools for observing and calculating celestial positions. The cumulative impression from examining these seals is that at least some Mesopotamian seal makers possessed detailed astronomical knowledge and considered it important enough to encode in artifacts used in daily commercial and administrative activities. The question becomes, how did they acquire this astronomical knowledge? The standard explanation is centuries of careful naked-eye observation, meticulous record-keeping, and gradual accumulation of data that allowed Mesopotamian astronomers to identify patterns and predict celestial movements. This explanation is certainly plausible for much of what we see in Mesopotamian astronomy. Dedicated observers tracking the sky night after night for generations could indeed map the movements of visible planets, identify zodiacal constellations, calculate eclipse cycles, and predict planetary positions with impressive accuracy. But some of the details preserved in cylinder seals and astronomical texts seem to exceed what naked-eye observation should reveal. Knowledge of planetary composition, understanding of orbital mechanics, awareness of celestial objects too faint to see without telescopes. These elements appear in Mesopotamian contexts in ways that make researchers uncomfortable. The usual explanation is that we're misinterpreting the evidence, reading modern astronomical knowledge back into ancient symbolic systems that meant something different to their creators. Yet the precision and consistency of this astronomical imagery suggests the ancient makers understood they were encoding real information about actual celestial phenomena. According to Mesopotamian tradition, astronomical knowledge was taught by the Anunnaki, who watched the skies with intensity and purpose, and instructed humans to do likewise. The text described the Anunnaki as beings who understood celestial mechanics, who knew the movements of heavenly bodies, who could predict eclipses and conjunctions and other celestial events. If we take these traditions as preserving historical memory rather than pure mythology, then perhaps the astronomical knowledge encoded in cylinder seals and tablets derives from instruction by teachers who already understood what they were teaching, who possessed comprehensive astronomical knowledge they systematically transferred to human students. The cylinder seals then become not just beautiful artifacts but encoded records, attempts to preserve astronomical knowledge in permanent portable form, miniature star maps and celestial diagrams that could survive the destruction of libraries and the forgetting that comes when civilizations collapse. They represent knowledge considered so important that it needed to be distributed widely, carved in stone that could endure, carried by merchants and scribes and administrators as they travelled across Mesopotamia, ensuring that astronomical wisdom would persist even if central repositories were destroyed. But whether this knowledge came from indigenous observation or divine instruction, whether the cylinder seals encode genuine astronomical data or symbolic religious imagery, the texts themselves record a clear progression, a gradual transformation in how the divine related to humanity. Reading through Mesopotamian texts chronologically reveal a fascinating transition. In the earlier Sumerian texts, gods regularly intervene in human affairs directly, appearing in physical form, engaging in combat, making pronouncements, and performing actions in the material world. By the time we reach later Babylonian and Assyrian texts, divine intervention becomes increasingly indirect, mediated through dreams, omens, and prophetic visions rather than direct appearance. The gods haven't disappeared from the religion, but they've retreated behind a veil, no longer walking among mortals but influencing events from a distance. This progression feels less like mythological evolution and more like historical memory of beings who were once present, but gradually withdrew, becoming increasingly distant until they existed only in ritual and remembrance. In the earlier Sumerian texts from around 2800 BCE, the Anunnaki are described taking direct physical action in the world. Inanna descends to the underworld and returns, passing through 7 gates, removing items of clothing and authority at each stage. Enlil walks through Nippur, sees the goddess Ninlil bathing, and pursues her. Enki travels through the marshes in his boat, distributing the me to various cities. These aren't abstract theological statements. They're narratives describing beings moving through physical space, interacting with the material world, performing actions that have direct observable consequences. Kings from this early period describe meeting gods face to face. Gudea of Lagash, ruling around 2100 BCE, recorded detailed dreams where deities appeared to him with specific instructions for temple construction. But he also describes waking encounters where gods walked beside him, inspected his building projects, and provided direct feedback on his work. The tone of these accounts suggests contemporary experiences, recent events, interactions that felt real and immediate to those recording them. Move forward a few centuries, and the quality of divine interaction begins to shift. By the time of Hammurabi around 3700 years ago, divine communication becomes more mediated. Hammurabi claims divine authority for his law code, stating that Shamash, the sun god and deity of justice, gave him the laws. But the narrative framework suggests this transmission happened through visions and inspired understanding rather than face-to-face conversation. The gods are still actively involved in human affairs, still granting authority and providing guidance, but the directness has diminished. There's a veil between divine and human realms that wasn't present in earlier accounts. By the first millennium BCE, in Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian texts, divine intervention has become almost entirely indirect. kings receive divine guidance through dreams that require interpretation by priests. Omens become the primary means of understanding divine will. Observing the flight of birds, examining the entrails of sacrificed animals, watching for celestial signs. The gods are still believed to be active, still controlling events, but they no longer appear directly. They work through signs and symbols, through priests and prophets, through mechanisms that preserve divine influence while removing direct divine presence. This progression is documented clearly enough that scholars have long noted it, usually explaining it as natural evolution of religious thought from more primitive anthropomorphic beliefs toward more sophisticated theological concepts. Yet the transition feels less like gradual evolution and more like deliberate withdrawal, as if beings who once interacted directly with humans made a conscious decision to step back, to increase the distance between themselves and mortals, to shift from direct presence to mediated influence. The texts themselves sometimes hint at reasons for this withdrawal. Fragmentary passages suggest the Anunnaki grew weary of constant human demands, that close contact with mortals became burdensome, that the noise and needs of humanity became overwhelming. Other passages hint at different motivations, suggesting that human development reached a point where direct divine presence was no longer necessary or appropriate, that mortals had learned enough to manage their own affairs, that the teacher-student relationship had evolved to a point where students needed to practice independence rather than continuing to rely on constant instruction. Some texts preserve something more intriguing, hints that the withdrawal wasn't entirely voluntary, that something about human development made continued close contact dangerous or impossible. These passages are frustratingly vague, using metaphorical language that obscures more than it reveals, but they consistently suggest that humans had changed in ways that altered the fundamental dynamics of divine-human interaction, that mortals had achieved or discovered something that made the old relationship untenable. One late Babylonian text describes the Anunnaki as having, quote, "two," a phrase that appears in multiple contexts and suggests not just physical distance, but a fundamental separation, as if the divine realm had been sealed off from human access in ways it hadn't been previously. Another text mentions the sealing of the gates, imagery that recurs across different periods and suggests deliberate closure of pathways that once connected mortal and divine realms. The archaeological evidence supports this textual progression. The earliest temples at sites like Eridu and Uruk show architectural features suggesting they were designed for actual divine residence, with sleeping chambers, dining areas, and spaces for daily activities as if the gods physically inhabited these buildings. Later temples become increasingly symbolic, designed for ritual and worship rather than actual habitation. The shift in architecture mirrors the shift in texts, both reflecting a transformation from divine presence to divine absence, from gods who lived among humans to gods who resided in distant heavens and interacted with humanity only through carefully mediated channels. This withdrawal left humanity managing civilization independently, relying on knowledge that had been taught but now needed to be preserved and developed without continued instruction, and in some rare cases, according to fragmentary texts, certain humans attempted to bridge this growing distance to achieve transformation that would elevate them closer to the divine level the Anunnaki had abandoned. Several fragmentary texts from ancient Mesopotamia hint at something that scholars have struggled to interpret: descriptions of humans undergoing transformation or enlightenment that fundamentally changed their nature. These texts use language that suggests not just intellectual growth, but something more profound, a shift in human capability or consciousness that elevated certain individuals closer to divine status. The most intriguing of these fragments come from temple libraries and describe initiates receiving knowledge in underground chambers, emerging changed in ways the texts describe with reverence but limited detail. Whatever this transformation was, it seems to have been rare, controlled, and considered dangerous by both human authorities and, according to the texts, by the Anunnaki themselves. The texts that preserve these hints are maddeningly incomplete. Damaged tablets with crucial sections missing, fragmentary references that assume readers already understand what's being described. But piecing together information from multiple sources reveals a pattern. Certain temples, particularly at Eridu, Nippur, and Sipar, maintained underground chambers used for secret rituals. Access to these chambers was restricted to initiated priests who had undergone years of training and demonstrated appropriate character and capability. What happened in these chambers was not recorded in texts meant for general audiences, but fragmentary references in priestly libraries suggest initiates received knowledge that fundamentally transformed their understanding and capabilities. One text describes a ritual lasting 7 days, during which an initiate remained in darkness in an underground chamber, fasting and performing prescribed recitations. The text emphasizes that this ritual was dangerous, that not all who entered emerged unchanged, that some initiates failed to complete the process and emerged damaged or disturbed by what they experienced. For those who successfully completed the ritual, the text describes a transformation. It characterizes as, quote, 4, quote, 5, quote, 6. These phrases are tantalizing but unclear. What does quote 7 mean in this context? What capabilities or understanding did initiates gain? The text suggests something beyond ordinary intellectual learning, some perceptual or cognitive shift that allowed transformed individuals to perceive or understand things hidden from ordinary humans. References to these transformed priests describe them as having special abilities, reading omens with uncanny accuracy, understanding the secret meanings of texts, predicting future events, healing diseases through knowledge rather than medicine. Another fragmentary text describes what it calls, quote 8, a process where initiated priests progressed through stages of knowledge, each stage granting access to deeper understanding and greater capability. The text uses architectural metaphors, describing 7 gates that must be passed, 7 chambers that must be entered, 7 levels of knowledge that must be mastered. At each stage, the initiate received fundamental knowledge or powers that transformed their nature and capabilities. The final stage, which the text describes with obvious awe, involved receiving knowledge that the Anunnaki themselves possessed, understanding that elevated the initiate to a level approaching divine capability. But the texts also emphasized that this transformation was dangerous and carefully controlled. Multiple passages warn that attempting to gain this knowledge without proper preparation, without the guidance of already transformed teachers, without the protections provided by ritual and temple setting, could destroy rather than elevate the aspirant. The knowledge being transmitted wasn't safe, wasn't meant for general access, carried risks that required careful management. According to these texts, the Anunnaki themselves had opinions about human transformation. Some fragmentary passages suggest certain Anunnaki, particularly Enki, supported human elevation, viewing it as the natural culmination of the education they had been providing all along. Other passages hint at opposition, suggesting some Anunnaki believed humans achieving divine-level knowledge threatened the established order, that the boundary between mortal and divine must be maintained, that elevating humans to near-divine status created dangers the texts don't fully specify. One particularly intriguing fragment describes a debate among the Anunnaki about those who have crossed over, apparently referring to humans who had achieved this transformation. The text records arguments about whether to allow the process to continue, whether to share additional knowledge with transformed humans, whether these elevated mortals represented success or danger. The text breaks off before recording the resolution, leaving modern scholars to wonder what decision was reached and how it was implemented. The archaeological evidence provides frustratingly little concrete information about these transformation rituals. Underground chambers have been found beneath temples at several sites, spaces that could have served the purposes these texts describe. Some of these chambers contain carved symbols and inscriptions that hint at ritual use, but nothing that clearly explains what ceremonies were performed there. The chambers themselves are architecturally sophisticated, with precise orientations and acoustic properties that suggest they were designed with specific purposes in mind, but those purposes remain unclear from physical evidence alone. What seems clear is that certain humans in ancient Mesopotamia underwent transformative experiences that their culture considered profound and dangerous, that granted capabilities or understanding beyond normal human capacity, and that connected to knowledge the Anunnaki supposedly possessed. Whether these were genuine transformations involving real changes in human capability, or elaborate initiatory rituals that granted social status and priestly authority without actually changing the initiate's fundamental nature, is impossible to determine from fragmentary evidence. But the texts treat these transformations as real, as meaningful, as representing genuine elevation of human capability toward divine levels of knowledge and power. And perhaps these transformed humans, these priests who had quote 10, quote 11, were the ones who finally discovered what the Anunnaki had been trying to keep hidden, who crossed the boundary that forced the final withdrawal of divine presence from human affairs, who achieved the understanding that made continued close contact between mortal and divine impossible, or unnecessary or dangerous in ways that ancient texts hint at but never fully explain. According to ancient tradition, the city of Sippar housed a library that predated the flood, a repository of antediluvian knowledge that was deliberately preserved against the coming catastrophe. While no archaeological evidence of this pre-Diluvian library has been found, the myth persists across multiple Mesopotamian cultures, described in texts that speak of it with longing, as if something precious and irreplaceable was lost. What makes this tradition particularly interesting is that several Mesopotamian texts claim to be copies of pre-Diluvian originals, preserved through the flood by scribes who knew the catastrophe was coming. These texts describe knowledge that the Anunnaki wanted to preserve, wisdom that couldn't be allowed to disappear even if the entire world had to be washed clean and started anew. Sippar, located on the eastern bank of the Euphrates north of Babylon, was one of the oldest and most continuously occupied cities in Mesopotamia. It served as a cult center for Shamash, the sun god, and maintained religious significance throughout thousands of years of Mesopotamian history. But according to tradition preserved in multiple sources, Sippar's importance went beyond its role as a religious center. It was, the texts claim, a repository of ancient knowledge, a place where wisdom from before the flood had been deliberately preserved for future generations. The tradition of the Sippar library appears in sources spanning different periods and cultures within Mesopotamia. Berossus, a Babylonian priest who wrote a history of Babylonia in Greek around 300 BCE, recorded that before the Great Flood, a god warned that humanity would be destroyed and instructed that texts containing all knowledge should be buried at Sippar in the City of the Sun, where they could be recovered after the waters subsided. According to Berossus, these buried texts were indeed recovered after the flood, excavated from their hiding place, and used to re-establish civilization with knowledge that would otherwise have been lost. Other texts make similar claims. Several astronomical and mathematical tablets include colophons, scribal notes at the end of texts, stating they are copies of antediluvian originals, knowledge preserved from before the flood. These colophons use specific terminology, describing the texts as having been, quote, 12, quote, or, quote, 13, quote. The scribes who added these notes weren't claiming to have composed original works, but to be preserving ancient knowledge, maintaining continuity with wisdom that predated the catastrophe that had reset human civilization. What's particularly intriguing is the consistency with which texts making these claims involve specific types of knowledge: astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and what might be called theoretical or philosophical understanding. These aren't mythological narratives or religious hymns claiming antediluvian origin. They're technical texts, practical knowledge, systematic understanding of natural phenomena. It's as if the scribes who preserved these texts believed that while the physical infrastructure of civilization could be rebuilt after catastrophe, certain types of knowledge were too valuable to risk losing, required deliberate preservation, needed to be protected and transmitted across the boundary of destruction. The texts sometimes hint at why this preservation was considered necessary. Some passages suggest the Anunnaki themselves ordered certain knowledge to be preserved, that they recognized the flood would destroy much, but wanted core understanding to survive so that post-flood humanity could rebuild civilization rather than starting from complete ignorance. Other passages hint at something more subversive, suggesting human scribes preserved knowledge the Anunnaki might have preferred to see destroyed, that the library at Sippar represented human determination to maintain accumulated wisdom regardless of divine intentions. One fragmentary text describes scribes working in secret as the flood approached, selecting the most important texts, making copies on the most durable materials, sealing them in waterproof containers, and burying them in locations they recorded so survivors could retrieve them after the waters subsided. The text describes this work with urgency and reverence, as if these scribes understood they were performing a service of profound importance, preserving humanity's intellectual heritage against apocalyptic destruction. Whether this account describes actual historical events or mythologizes natural processes of knowledge, preservation across civilizational disruption is impossible to determine. but the tradition itself reveals how ancient Mesopotamians understood knowledge as precious, fragile, requiring active protection, too valuable to allow catastrophe to erase. Archaeologists have searched for physical evidence of this library, hoping to find pre-Diluvian texts or evidence of ancient archives at Sippar, but the site has been difficult to excavate. Early archaeological work in the 19th and early 20th centuries uncovered thousands of tablets from various periods, but flooding, looting, and the degradation of mud brick architecture have made systematic excavation challenging. No clearly pre-Diluvian materials have been identified, though distinguishing truly ancient tablets from later copies would be difficult given how consistently Mesopotamian scribes reproduced older texts with faithful accuracy. Yet even if the physical library remains undiscovered or never existed, the tradition itself is significant. It reveals that ancient Mesopotamians conceived of knowledge as having history, as being preserved across time, as connecting post-flood humanity to antediluvian wisdom through deliberate effort. The Library of Sippar, whether real or mythological, represents the idea that human understanding could survive catastrophe, that wisdom once gained need not be lost, that knowledge itself possessed a kind of immortality that transcended the mortality of individual humans or even of entire civilizations. And if we take these traditions seriously, if some core of knowledge was indeed preserved across the flood boundary, then perhaps post-flood humanity rebuilt not from ignorance, but from a foundation of inherited understanding, using preserved wisdom to accelerate their redevelopment, achieving in centuries what might otherwise have required millennia. And perhaps in studying this preserved knowledge, in building upon foundations laid before the flood, some humans eventually discovered things their ancestors hadn't known, pushed understanding into territories even the antediluvian sages hadn't explored, reached insights that changed everything about how humans understood themselves and their relationship to those they had worshipped as gods. Here's where we encounter the possibility that has haunted Mesopotamian archaeology for decades. What if humans discovered something that the Anunnaki hadn't intended them to find? The clay tablets preserve records of mathematical discoveries, astronomical observations, and metallurgical experiments that pushed the boundaries of what humans were supposed to know. And buried in some of these texts are hints of a discovery so profound that it changed the relationship between mortals and those they worshipped as divine. Some scholars have speculated about what this discovery might have been. Perhaps the mathematical proof that the universe operates on natural laws rather than divine will. Perhaps the astronomical observations that demonstrated the gods' teachings about the cosmos were incomplete or incorrect. Perhaps metallurgical techniques that produced materials the Anunnaki claimed were exclusive to divine creation. The tablets preserve moments of discovery, breakthrough insights where human understanding suddenly expanded into new territory. Mathematical texts show scribes working through complex problems, making errors, correcting themselves, building towards solutions that required genuine creative thinking rather than just applying established formulas. These aren't scribes mechanically copying received knowledge. These are thinkers pushing boundaries, exploring mathematical territory beyond what they were taught, discovering principles through their own intellectual effort. One particularly intriguing mathematical tablet shows work on what appears to be a problem involving infinite series, mathematical concepts that shouldn't appear in ancient texts at all. The scribe is clearly struggling with the implications of their calculations, working through iterations that suggest they've discovered something unexpected, something their mathematical training hadn't prepared them to handle. The tablet breaks off without resolution, leaving the impression of a mathematician confronting insights that exceeded their conceptual framework, grappling with understanding that didn't fit comfortably within received knowledge. Astronomical texts show similar patterns. Observers recording celestial phenomena note anomalies, discrepancies between what their inherited models predict and what they actually observe. Some texts show astronomers revising traditional understandings, creating new models that better fit observational data, discovering that the cosmos operates according to principles more complex than their teachings had suggested. These weren't priests blindly accepting traditional astronomy. These were empirical observers refining their understanding based on evidence, following data wherever it led even when it contradicted established doctrine. One astronomical text records what appears to be the discovery that celestial events could be predicted through calculation alone, without need for divine intervention or interpretation. The text describes this realization with tones that mix excitement and unease, as if the scribe recognized they had stumbled upon something significant and potentially dangerous. If the movements of heavens followed mathematical laws that humans could calculate, if celestial phenomena resulted from natural mechanics rather than divine will, then what role remained for gods in cosmic governance? The text doesn't explicitly draw this conclusion, but the implications hover beneath the surface, unspoken but present. Metallurgical texts record experiments with new alloys, new techniques, achievements that produced materials the Anunnaki had supposedly reserved for divine use. One text describes creating what it calls, quote, 14, a substance that the text emphasizes was previously known only to the gods, now reproduced through human craft and knowledge. The tone of this text is triumphant, proud, celebrating human capability to achieve what had been exclusive to the divine. Yet it also includes warnings, suggestions that producing such materials violated boundaries, that humans achieving divine-level craft could bring consequences the text doesn't specify. What connects these various discoveries, mathematical, astronomical, metallurgical, is their common implication. Humans were discovering that the universe operated according to principles they could understand and manipulate, that the knowledge supposedly given by the Anunnaki was not complete or exclusive, that mortals could achieve understanding and capabilities that matched or exceeded what they had been taught. And if humans could discover truth independently, if they could understand cosmic principles through reason and observation, if they could create materials and predict phenomena previously attributed to divine power, then the fundamental relationship between human and divine had to change. Some scholars have speculated about a specific discovery that might have served as catalyst, a single breakthrough that crystallized these accumulating insights into a revolutionary realization. Perhaps it was the mathematical proof that universal principles existed independently of divine will, eternal laws that even gods couldn't violate. Perhaps it was astronomical observation that demonstrated the Anunnaki's own teachings about celestial mechanics were incomplete or incorrect, proving that the supposed divine teachers had themselves been ignorant of cosmic truths humans could now calculate. Perhaps it was metallurgical or chemical achievement that proved matter itself followed rules humans could master, that nothing in physical creation was exclusively divine, that with sufficient knowledge humans could reproduce any material effect. We don't know what specific discovery might have served this catalytic role, but the tablets preserve hints that something happened. Some realization occurred that fundamentally shifted how humans understood their relationship to the divine. References appear to quote 15, to quote 16, to quote 17 phrases that suggest a defining moment of human awakening, an intellectual transformation that made the old relationship between mortals and gods impossible to maintain. And perhaps this is why the Anunnaki withdrew, not because humans became too numerous or too noisy, not because gods grew weary of mortal demands, but because humans had achieved understanding that made divine presence unnecessary or dangerous or impossible. If humans discovered they could understand universal principles independently, that they could develop knowledge beyond what they were taught, that they could achieve capabilities supposedly exclusive to the divine, then what purpose did continued divine guidance serve? The teacher-student relationship had evolved beyond teaching. Humans had become independent thinkers, capable of discovering truth through their own efforts, no longer requiring or perhaps no longer accepting divine instruction. And in achieving this intellectual independence, humans had perhaps discovered the one thing the Anunnaki truly couldn't tolerate, the realization that gods weren't necessary, that the universe operated according to comprehensible natural principles, that humanity could understand and master their world without divine intervention. Around 1300 BCE, something happened across the ancient Near East that historians call the Bronze Age collapse. Cities burned, civilizations fell, trade routes disappeared, and literacy itself nearly vanished in some regions. But before this catastrophic period, there's another, more subtle transition in the archaeological record. The texts that once described close human-divine interaction gradually stop. The elaborate temple complexes that once served as points of contact between human and divine realms begin to change function, becoming more administrative and less mystical. The priests who once claimed to mediate direct divine communication begin speaking in more abstract theological terms. It's as if the infrastructure of divine human contact was dismantled deliberately, carefully, by beings who knew they were leaving and wanted to manage their departure. The Bronze Age collapse was real, catastrophic, and still not fully understood by modern historians. Within a span of decades around 1200 BCE, the great civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East experienced simultaneous crises. The Hittite Empire collapsed entirely. Its capital Hattusa burned and abandoned. Mycenaean Greece fragmented into warring chiefdoms, losing literacy and urban organization for centuries. Cyprus saw widespread destruction. The Levantine coast burned, city after city showing archaeological evidence of violent destruction in a narrow time window. Egypt survived but lost its imperial territories and suffered invasions by mysterious, quote, 18 whose origins remain debated. Mesopotamia experienced less dramatic collapse than some regions, but it wasn't spared. Cities declined, trade networks fractured, literacy decreased outside major urban centers. The archaeological record shows disruption, though less complete devastation than in areas further west. But more significant than the physical disruption is the cultural transition visible in texts from the centuries preceding the Bronze Age collapse, a gradual transformation in how Mesopotamian civilization related to the divine. Temple archives from this period show administrative documents increasingly displacing religious texts. The great temples remain centers of economic and political power, but the religious functions become more routinized, more ritual-focused, less mystical. Priests still perform ceremonies, still maintain complex calendars of festivals and offerings, still claim to interpret divine will through omens and signs, but the texts describing these activities become more formulaic, as if recording established procedures rather than reporting dynamic interactions with active divine presences. The tone of religious texts shifts. Earlier Mesopotamian literature describes gods intervening dramatically in human affairs, appearing to kings, speaking through prophets, performing miracles that disrupted natural order. By the late Bronze Age, divine action becomes increasingly subtle, working through established channels respecting natural processes. The gods haven't disappeared from Mesopotamian religion, but they've become less immediate, less interventionist, less obviously present in daily affairs. Religious thought becomes more abstract, more philosophical, more concerned with eternal principles than contemporary divine activity. Archaeological evidence supports this transition. Temple architecture changes, with spaces that earlier served as divine residences converted to storage, administration, or priestly quarters. The elaborate mechanisms for feeding and clothing divine statues continue, but texts suggest these rituals are increasingly understood as symbolic rather than literally serving resident deities. The temples remain the wealthiest, most powerful institutions in Mesopotamian society, but their function shifts from housing gods to maintaining traditions, from facilitating divine human contact to preserving established religious practices. Some texts hint at explanations for this transition. Fragmentary passages suggest the gods withdrew to distant realms, that they closed the gates between heaven and earth, that they veiled themselves from mortal eyes. These aren't presented as punishment or abandonment, but as transition, as if the divine presence that had characterized earlier periods had served its purpose and was no longer necessary or appropriate. One text describes the Anunnaki, quote, 22, quote, phrasing that suggests both physical departure and restoration of proper distance between mortal and divine realms. The timing of this divine withdrawal relative to the Bronze Age collapse raises intriguing questions. Did the Anunnaki withdraw before the collapse, perhaps contributing to civilizational instability by removing divine guidance that societies had relied upon? Did they withdraw during the collapse, abandoning humanity in its moment of crisis? Or did they withdraw after, recognizing that humanity had proven capable of surviving catastrophe independently, that mortal civilizations could rebuild without divine assistance, that the teacher-student relationship had reached its natural conclusion? The archaeological evidence doesn't provide clear chronology, but the textual tradition suggests the withdrawal preceded the worst destruction, that by the time Bronze Age civilizations collapsed, the Anunnaki had already stepped back from active presence, that humanity faced its crisis already accustomed to managing affairs without direct divine intervention, and perhaps that was the final test, the ultimate demonstration that humans had achieved independence, that they could survive catastrophe, preserve knowledge, rebuild civilization without gods walking among them, without divine teachers guiding their every step. The infrastructure that had facilitated divine human contact, the temple complexes, the priestly hierarchies, the ritual systems, persisted after the Anunnaki withdrew, but it functioned differently, maintaining memory of divine presence rather than enabling contemporary contact. The priests who had once mediated between humans and physically present gods became custodians of tradition, preservers of ancient knowledge, interpreters of texts describing relationships that no longer existed in contemporary reality. The temples that had housed gods became museums of divinity, sacred spaces where past divine presence was remembered and honoured, but no longer expected or experienced. And in this transition, humanity inherited both tremendous gift and terrible burden. They inherited civilization, the accumulated knowledge and infrastructure the Anunnaki had helped them build, but they also inherited responsibility, the need to maintain and develop that civilization without divine guidance, to preserve knowledge without divine teachers, to make decisions without divine intervention. Humanity had achieved independence, but independence meant managing alone, solving problems through their own efforts, facing an uncertain future with only their inherited knowledge and developing capabilities to guide them. Even after the Anunnaki vanished from active presence in Mesopotamian texts, their legacy remained embedded in every aspect of civilization. The writing they supposedly taught formed the basis of human record-keeping for millennia. The mathematics they shared built cities and calculated the movements of stars. The agricultural knowledge they imparted fed empires. But perhaps most significantly, they left humanity with something more dangerous than any of these practical gifts. They left humans with the memory that they weren't alone, that knowledge came from somewhere, and that the divine wasn't necessarily beyond reach or understanding. This memory, preserved in myth and ritual, carried within it the seed of all human questioning, the drive to understand what the Anunnaki understood, to see what they saw, to reach the level of knowledge that once belonged exclusively to gods. The practical legacy is visible everywhere in ancient civilization. Cuneiform writing, developed in Sumer around 3200 BCE, spread across the ancient Near East, adapted to write dozens of languages, remained in use for 3,000 years. The mathematical principles taught in Sumerian schools provided the foundation for Babylonian astronomy, which in turn influenced Greek mathematics, which shaped Islamic scholarship, which fed into European science. The agricultural techniques developed in Mesopotamia spread throughout the Mediterranean and Near East, making possible the population densities that supported classical civilizations. The legal concepts codified in texts like Hammurabi's Law Code influenced jurisprudence across millennia. Trace any thread of ancient knowledge forward through time, and it connects eventually to foundations laid in Mesopotamia, to principles and practices that texts attribute to divine teachers, to knowledge that appeared with suspicious completeness at the dawn of recorded history. The Anunnaki, whether understood as literal divine beings or as metaphor for knowledge transmission from unknown sources, left humanity with functional civilization, with working knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, agriculture, medicine, metallurgy, architecture, law, and literacy. But beyond practical knowledge, they left something more intangible and perhaps more significant: They left humanity with the concept that knowledge is learnable, that understanding can be transmitted, that wisdom doesn't have to be discovered independently by each generation but can be taught, preserved, built upon across time. They left the idea that intelligence isn't fixed but can be developed, that humans aren't limited by their natural capabilities but can be educated to achieve more than raw instinct would allow. They left the recognition that knowledge is power, that understanding principles allows manipulation of reality, that those who know more can achieve more. Most importantly, they left humanity with the memory of divine teachers, beings who possessed knowledge and chose to share it, gods who walked among mortals and transferred understanding that elevated human capability. This memory, whether historically accurate or mythologically embellished, established a template for human aspiration. If gods could know these things, perhaps humans could too. If divine teachers could understand mathematics and astronomy and medicine, perhaps human students could learn these subjects completely, achieving understanding equal to their teachers. If the Anunnaki possessed the me, those fundamental principles governing reality, perhaps humans could discover those principles independently, mastering truth through reason and observation rather than requiring divine revelation. This was the dangerous gift, the legacy that contained within it the seeds of human intellectual independence. By teaching humans, by demonstrating that knowledge could be transmitted and understood, by proving that divine secrets could become human understanding, the Anunnaki created the possibility of their own obsolescence. They gave humanity not just specific knowledge, but the meta-knowledge that knowledge itself was accessible, that understanding was achievable, that mortals could learn what gods knew. And humanity took that lesson and ran with it, preserving what they were taught, building upon it, discovering new principles, developing new techniques, pushing constantly against the boundaries of inherited knowledge into territories their teachers hadn't mapped. The drive to understand, to discover, to know became a defining characteristic of human civilization, a restless dissatisfaction with received wisdom, an insistence on testing and verifying and expanding beyond what previous generations had established. The myths of Prometheus bringing fire to humanity, of Enki sharing the me against the wishes of other gods, of various trickster figures teaching humans divine secrets. These stories appear across cultures in various forms, suggesting a widespread recognition that human knowledge came from somewhere, was taught rather than purely discovered, represented a kind of theft or forbidden transmission that changed humanity's fundamental nature and relationship to the divine. And implicit in all these stories is the recognition that knowledge once given cannot be taken back, that understanding once achieved cannot be erased, that humanity having learned cannot be made ignorant again. The Anunnaki withdrew, but their legacy remained, embedded in cuneiform tablets, preserved in agricultural practices, encoded in mathematical formulas, remembered in myths and traditions, and that legacy continued to generate consequences long after its originators had departed, as humans built upon what they were taught, discovered what they weren't taught, eventually achieved understanding that transcended their divine instruction, and made them, in some meaningful sense, the intellectual equals of beings they had once worshipped as gods. Today, archaeologists continue excavating Mesopotamian sites, translating tablets that have lain unread for thousands of years, and piecing together the puzzle of humanity's earliest civilizations. Each new discovery adds texture to the story, but also raises new questions. In museum archives across Europe and the Middle East, hundreds of thousands of cuneiform tablets remain untranslated, waiting for scholars who can read the dead languages and interpret the ancient knowledge they contain. Some of these tablets might hold answers about what really happened in the deep past, about the nature of the Anunnaki, and about the knowledge that transformed humanity from created servants into beings capable of discovering truths that even their creators might have preferred remained hidden. The search continues, patient as the clay tablets themselves, waiting for someone to ask the right questions and finally understand what the ancient Sumerians were truly trying to preserve in their urgent, careful script. The work of translating and interpreting Mesopotamian texts continues in universities and museums around the world. The University of Pennsylvania, Yale University, the British Museum, the Louvre, the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, and dozens of other institutions house collections of cuneiform tablets numbering in the tens of thousands. Scholars estimate that only a fraction of known tablets have been translated, and new tablets continue to be excavated from sites across Iraq and neighbouring countries when political and security situations permit archaeological work. Each translated tablet potentially adds new information, confirms or contradicts existing theories, raises new questions about ancient Mesopotamian civilization. A tablet that languished untranslated in a museum basement for a century might contain astronomical data that clarifies ancient calendars, a medical text that preserves treatments unknown from other sources, a mathematical problem that demonstrates sophistication beyond what scholars had attributed to ancient mathematics, or a fragmentary myth that sheds light on religious development. The pace of discovery is slow, limited by the number of scholars who can read Sumerian and Akkadian, by the fragmentary nature of many tablets, by the difficulty of interpreting texts that assume cultural context we no longer possess. But the work continues, driven by fascination with humanity's earliest literate civilization, by desire to understand how civilization itself developed, by questions about whether the ancient Mesopotamians recorded historical truth or mythological invention when they described divine teachers walking among humanity. Modern scholars remain skeptical of literal interpretations, preferring to understand the Anunnaki as mythological constructs, personifications of natural forces, or symbolic representations of knowledge transmission processes. Yet even skeptical scholars acknowledge the mysteries embedded in the archaeological record, the rapid development of Sumerian civilization, the sophisticated knowledge appearing at civilization's beginning, the consistent traditions across centuries describing divine teachers and human students. Some researchers, following paths opened by controversial figures like Zikara Sitchin, explore alternative interpretations, suggesting the Anunnaki might represent something more literal than conventional scholarship acknowledges. These alternative researchers face strong criticism from mainstream academia, accused of cherry-picking evidence, misinterpreting texts, and making claims that exceed what the evidence supports. Yet they raise questions that conventional scholarship sometimes dismisses too quickly. How did sophisticated knowledge appear so suddenly? Why do multiple independent cultures describe divine teachers? What exactly were ancient peoples trying to communicate when they recorded these traditions with such care and consistency? The debate between conventional and alternative interpretations continues, unlikely to be definitively resolved without new evidence. But regardless of how we interpret the Anunnaki, as literal beings, as mythological constructs, as metaphors for knowledge transmission, the texts themselves remain, preserving traditions that ancient peoples considered important enough to record in permanent form, to copy and recopying across generations, to protect and preserve through catastrophes and civilizational collapses, and perhaps buried in some still untranslated tablet, in some fragmentary text awaiting discovery or decipherment, lies information that would clarify everything, that would finally answer the questions that have puzzled scholars for more than a century. Perhaps somewhere in the hundreds of thousands of unread tablets is the text that explicitly describes what humans discovered that forced the Anunnaki to withdraw, the record that names the specific breakthrough that transformed humanity from students to independent thinkers, the account that finally explains why beings who supposedly walked among humans for thousands of years suddenly disappeared from history as if they had never existed. Or perhaps the answer isn't waiting in some undiscovered tablet, but has been sitting in museum collections all along, encoded in texts scholars have already translated but not yet understood, embedded in mathematical formulas we can read but haven't fully interpreted, preserved in astronomical observations whose deeper meaning we haven't recognized. Perhaps the ancient Sumerians recorded everything clearly, but we haven't yet learned to ask the right questions, to see what they were showing us, to understand what they were trying so urgently to preserve. The clay tablets remain, patient and permanent as stone, holding their secrets until we achieve sufficient understanding to decode them properly. Somewhere in those wedge-shaped marks pressed into mud 5,000 years ago might be the answer to one of humanity's most fundamental questions. Where did our knowledge come from? Were we taught by beings more advanced than ourselves? Or did we slowly, painfully discover everything through our own efforts? And if we were taught, what happened to our teachers? Why did they leave? What did we discover that made their presence no longer necessary, or no longer possible, or no longer safe? The ancient texts hint at answers but never state them plainly, as if the Sumerians themselves weren't entirely certain, as if they were recording questions as much as answers, preserving traditions they hoped future generations might finally understand. And so the search continues. Archaeologists excavating, linguists translating, historians interpreting, all seeking to bridge the vast gulf of time separating us from humanity's first civilization, trying to understand what those ancient peoples knew and what they were trying to tell us across 50 centuries of silence. And perhaps, in seeking to understand them, we're continuing the work they started, following the path they pointed toward, pursuing the same drive to know, to understand, to discover truth that they inherited from their supposed divine teachers and passed down to us through unbroken chains of transmission, stretching from ancient Sumer to the modern world, connecting us across time to those first humans who looked at the stars with intensity, who pressed knowledge into clay with urgent care, who worshipped beings they claimed had taught them everything, and who eventually achieved understanding that made those teachers no longer necessary, no longer present, no longer anything but memory and myth and questions that still, after all these millennia, wait patiently for answers. And so, as you drift towards sleep tonight, somewhere between dream and history, consider the ancient scribes pressing warnings and wisdom to wet clay by lamplight, knowing they would never see the future they were trying to protect. Consider the astronomers watching stars move across Mesopotamian skies with intensity that suggests they were looking for something, waiting for something, tracking patterns they had been taught carried meaning beyond beauty. Consider the priests descending into underground chambers seeking transformation, emerging changed in ways their world considered both sacred and dangerous. Consider the moment, lost to history but preserved in myth, when humans discovered something that made gods no longer necessary, when mortals achieved understanding that forced the divine to retreat into memory and symbol. The tablets rest in museum cases now, behind protective glass, their cuneiform marks still holding questions we're only beginning to answer. But perhaps that's fitting. Perhaps some knowledge is meant to wait, patient as stone, until the moment we're ready to understand what our ancestors were truly saying. Perhaps the Anunnaki, whether literal beings or metaphor for something we haven't yet named, left us not just with knowledge, but with the capacity to seek it, the drive to question, the refusal to accept mystery as final. And perhaps their greatest gift wasn't the mathematics or astronomy or agriculture they supposedly taught, but the demonstration that knowledge itself is achievable, that understanding is possible, that humans need not remain ignorant of the principles governing their existence. In teaching us, they showed us we could learn. In withdrawing, they showed us we could think independently. In disappearing, they forced us to continue alone, to discover on our own, to become the questioners and seekers and understanders they perhaps always intended us to become. So let yourself drift now into the same darkness those ancient astronomers watched, under the same stars they tracked with such careful intensity. You're connected to them across time, part of the same human story of watching, wondering, and trying to understand the mysteries written in the heavens and buried in the earth. The questions they asked are questions we're still asking. The knowledge they preserved is knowledge we're still discovering. The transformation they underwent is transformation we're still experiencing. This endless human becoming, this constant reaching toward understanding. Rest now. The ancient world will still be here, waiting to share its secrets when you wake. The tablets will still hold their questions. The stars will still trace their patterns. The mystery of what happened when gods walked among humans will still wait, patient as clay, for the moment when we finally understand what our ancestors were trying so urgently to tell us across the vast silence of 5,000 years. Sleep well.